everybody to We Robot 2023. It's a pleasure to see you all. For those that have been here before, welcome back. For those that are new, welcome for the first time. We think this is a really special community and scholarly event where not only we get to discuss a lot of things formally here on the stage, which I hope that you will find enjoyable and beneficial, but also where people can meet each other, ideas can generate, and I can't tell you how many countless research projects have come from people talking about something over coffee or lunch or whatever it is. And so all of this is to say, look to your left and look to your right. If you don't know people that are sitting next to you, reach out and say hi to them, get to know someone, because this is the place where I think a lot of really exciting ideas can happen. So, my co-host, Kate, let me know that we're already 20 minutes behind, so I'm going to move relatively quickly, but my session is the one that's next, so if we cut it slightly short, then that's okay. So just a few logistics before we get started about We Robot, just to set everyone level set. First thing, welcome to the Boston University School of Law. We hope that you enjoy it here. This is an open building, and so one of the things you might want to consider is when you leave for lunch or other things, maybe take your laptop with you or things around, just because other people will be in and out of the building significantly throughout the day, and so just a reminder about that. Also, this is being recorded, and so just keep that in mind as you ask questions. More than once I have appreciated knowing that something is being recorded so that I don't ask the thing that was really on my mind. We were really hoping that we could have lunch outside, and we're still hoping to be able to, because the forecast shows like rain now and rain later, but maybe not rain in the middle. But it's possible that we may need to move lunch inside into the barrister's room, which is sort of in the back of the law school. You'll see it when you walk right through. Just keep your eyes open for an announcement on that. One thing that we wanted to talk about just really quickly is that this year, like last year, we will be following a code of conduct to make sure that this is the kind of conference that adheres to our values. So I would just like to take a second and ask that everyone please read the code of conduct, just so that we all know what our expectations are about the way in which we will conduct ourselves here. If anyone feels as though there has been some sort of violation of our code, we would like for you to come speak to me or one of my co-hosts, Stacey Dogan or Kate Darling, and we would be happy to talk with you about it and try to make it right. But I just wanted to take a little bit of time so that everyone can know what our commitments are at this event. Has everyone had time to look at it? Are we all on the same page? All right. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I also want to, before we begin, say a few thanks to a few people. So first, I would like, for those of you that went, and I know that a lot of you were there, to join me in thanking my co-host Kate Darling for planning an amazing pre-conference workshop. I think it was one of the most enjoyable and innovative that I've ever been to, and thanks to all of those that worked to make that a reality, particularly those at the Boston Dynamics AI Institute, which was a lovely venue as well.
Not part of Boston Dynamics.
Right, which is not part of Boston Dynamics. Which I think right. We're obligated to say, but I also wanted to thank my co-hosts generally, Kate Darling and Stacey Dogan, who worked really diligently, very hard to make this happen. So thank you both for all of your hard work. Also thanks to Elizabeth Clancy and her team. I don't know if it's Elizabeth here, but an incredible team of people who are working hard to pull off this conference. As you all know, it is not the sort of thing that you can do alone. You need lots of help, and they've done an incredible work. I'm going to be thanking them multiple times throughout the day, so just get ready. But I'm incredibly appreciative. Where's John? John, excellent. John also did our incredible work. All the materials were available on the website, among other things, and that we were able to have you did incredible work making on the conference submission system, and so thank you very much for navigating the most Byzantine user interface structure I've ever encountered. So,
Because you're a legal scholar.
right, because I'm right, exactly, which is part of our whole deal here, is bringing worlds together. Finally, I would really like to take a second and thank our sponsors. This conference could not have happened without the support of our amazing sponsors, and so we'll be showing them throughout the day. And so if you could just join me one time the organizations that thought it was important enough that this conference was special and should continue, and we really, really appreciate that. All right, so I think I've covered everything. I'm looking at my co-hosts to make sure. Is there anything else we need to do? All right, so without further ado, please welcome, oh, it's me. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our first session. For those of you that aren't familiar, the way in which we're going to proceed is, at We Robot, of course, the paper author does not present the paper themselves. Instead, the paper, there's a discussant who will come up and summarize the paper very briefly and then give some feedback. And then the rest of the session will be devoted to Q&A. One of the things that we're doing, so the longtime attendees may think to yourself, now wait a second, where is the microphone? We usually have two microphones set right up here, but here at this classroom, it's very fancy. There are microphones embedded everywhere, which as a privacy scholar is sort of weird, but I get the utility of it. And so this year what we're going to do is have pretend microphones, where if you look down here, we have tape here. This is where the Q begins, and so anyone that when we move to the Q&A portion of We Robot, all you have to do is come up to the pretend microphone, and a Q will start here, and a Q will start here, and our discussants will then work our way through recognizing what the questions are, and then that's the way the workshop will be conducted. Any questions? Does anyone have any questions before we move? All right, excellent. Thank you very much. So now I'll turn it over to the gay Katie Creel.
All right, awesome. Can you hear me okay? Is this doing anything? No? Good. Wonderful. No?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, great. So thanks so much for being here, and thanks to the organizers for this amazing event. I'm really excited. This is my first time here. And I have the pleasure of commenting on a paper by Woody and McKenna. And so what I want to do is first just very briefly summarize the paper, and then take us through some things that I was thinking about as I was reading the paper, and then see what you all have to say about it. So the essential definition and distinction in the paper is the distinction between thinking about things that occur at scale as scale is more, and this is where there is some kind of activity, and the activity's costs or benefits have a linear relationship as they increase. So we are buying this thing for $1. If we were going to buy 100 of the things, they would be $100, and there's no further dynamic involved with the scaling of that purchase from 1 to 100. Whereas scale is different, it's something where there's some qualitatively new or different issue that arises beyond the amount of activity. So this could be like, I'm still buying the thing for $100, but now because I'm a large purchaser, I get a special account set up at the firm, and then I have special benefits or privileges or types of financing or something like that. That's actually a much more boring example than all the examples in the paper. So I don't know why I went with that one. Okay, so there are at least 4 different ways that scale is different can change. One, the population affected can change. So for example, we're collecting a lot of data, and then we gain from that data not just information about the people who are present in the data set, but also patterns that are only learnable when the data is of a certain size. So I'm learning things that can then generalize beyond the data set to some broader group of individuals not contained in the data set. Number two, we can think about the scale of activity as creating sort of new emergent problems. For example, one delivery robot on the sidewalks might be a nuisance, but a lot of them could be a traffic jam or potentially an ADA violation. So we thought we had created, nice curb cut sidewalks. Now they're plugged with delivery robots that don't move. Or there's some kind of misinformation that's happening at such a scale that it creates a potentially epistemic free-for-all where no one knows what's true and none of the information is treated in a way that treats it as sort of like true information. Type 3, there's the scale of activity challenges the original assumptions about the costs and benefits. So this is sort of a reflective dynamic where originally we thought we'd done a good analysis of this trade-off, and now as the scale of the activity increases, we realize that the original weighing activity that we did no longer works. So this is sort of a subset of emergent problems where there's a different dynamic effect. So the example they use there is dark patterns. And then 4, scale can affect the efficacy of solutions. So one example that they don't mention that I thought might fit here is it might be possible in a very small site or social network to do moderation by hand or moderation by humans, but there might be some scale at which that solution isn't viewed as practical anymore or has other emergent problems. The example they mentioned is adding a noise to otherwise very quiet electric cars. That makes sense under the background conditions that most cars do in fact make noise due to having engines. But if the overall ecosystem shifted such that almost all cars were electric, then we might have a question, is there something else we want to do besides adding noise to all the cars if that's no longer the background assumption? Okay, so if we accept this distinction between scale is more and scale is different, which I think we should, the implications that they raise are, 1, we should start with scale. So start with that as sort of the operative analytic concept for dealing with problems of technology. 2, I think, drawing on issue number 3, regulators should regularly reassess to see if adoption of the technology has changed the landscape. And 3, there's a question that arises of, given this scale, should the problem be addressed via regulation or private litigation? Okay, so now moving to my comments. The authors asked us at the beginning to respond to the question of, is scale more versus scale is different a cogent question? I think yes. I have a couple ideas for how to refine the definitions, but I think overall this is very helpful. So the paper begins with heterogeneous definitions of scale drawn from various different subfields. Because I like the author's definitions of scale is more versus scale is different, I think you should just ruthlessly organize all of those definitions under your definitions and just say this is what we're doing, because I thought your definitions are great. So when I got the invitation to give these comments, I was really excited, both because I think this topic is really important and because my advisor's most famous paper is called The Tyranny of Scale. So I was like, Bob Batterman, this one's for you. So in it, he is a philosopher of science and he talks about material science. And he says, look, the tyranny of scale is that there are materials that display different dominant behaviors at different length scales. So if we're looking at the nanoscale of a material like a steel beam, we're interested in atoms, we're interested in the lattice structure, we're interested in the strength of ionic bonds. And then if we're looking at the scale of meters, we're interested in, does this material bend, does it buckle, under what conditions does it shatter? And for a long time, there weren't good mathematical equations that tied these two. There wasn't a way to just start with, okay, from this behavior of the atoms, the lattice structure, can we directly predict what the behavior of the steel beam is going to be at the meter scale? So I want to kind of riff on that and think, normally when people are in this position and they're critiquing a paper that puts forward a definition, they want to make the definition more fuzzy and say, oh, there are things you haven't thought of. I actually kind of want to do the opposite. So in the scale is different definition, you say there are different behaviors or effects that emerge at different orders of magnitude. I think you can, that arise beyond some scale of the activity. I think you can actually say it is specifically at different orders of magnitude. So it's specifically at, 1 to 10, 1 to 100, 1 to 1,000, 1 to 1,000,000, 1,000 to 200 million. Like, I think it's not just any kind of movement along this scale. I think all the effects in the paper, and I tried to go through and look at them, are things that arise at specifically different orders of magnitude. So I wonder if that's something you would want to incorporate. And then the original definition, you talk about only going from small to large. I think you could also, now this is loosening a little bit, but I think you could say more neutrally, a different behavior or effect emerges at different orders of magnitude scales. So that would allow you to account for cases where you could have different effects as you go from large to small. So we've seen this with the collapse of some social networks. You can have scaling effects in reverse. Okay. So a second proposal is to think about how the definition deals with statistical cases. So what about a case where there's some kind of treatment or vaccination or effect that has an interaction with a genetically rare variant such that at a certain scale, if this treatment is given to enough people, it's statistically guaranteed that someone will die, but we maybe can't know in advance who that person will be. So initially it seems like this would be a scale as more. The effect is always present, even when you give it to 10 people, even though it's extremely unlikely that someone will die within those 10 people. It's possible that someone with that variant is contained within that population. But as you move to giving it to 300 people, it becomes basically guaranteed. Although again, we still don't know on which of the instances it will occur. So with these kinds of statistically predictable effects, what do you want to say that this scale is more? It's the same effect, but it directly varies in proportion with the amount? Or would you want to say that there's a threshold effect, where once we get above the guarantee of one statistical life, now scale is different, because by giving this treatment, we're necessarily saying, or statistically saying, that at least one person will die because of it. So I think that's a substantive question. I would love to know what you think. I could imagine you going either way. But I think this brings up this question of heterogeneity versus consistency. So in the previous example, scale mattered precisely because of heterogeneity. So scale mattered because people are different, that at a large enough population, some people would have this characteristic. Whereas scale could also matter because of homogeneity. So those are the cases that you mentioned. So Deborah Hellman and I have a paper where we look at what if there's some kind of effect that at a certain scale, when all decision makers in an ecosystem are deciding the same way, those effects end up concentrated on the same individual people because of the consistency of the decision making. So that's a case where there's some group of people or a subgroup that have a certain characteristic, and if everyone is deciding the same way, they all get the same effects. But there, it's about the consistency of the decision makers, in addition to the heterogeneity of the population that have different characteristics. Okay, as a minor point, in the paper, class action is currently under scale is more. I kind of get that, but at the same time, I feel like given the way that the paper describes dark patterns, where each harm is negligible, but at scale they matter, you could say that that also applies to certain class actions. So you could say, if I'm defrauded of 75 cents on every can of tuna fish I buy, that's pretty negligible for many people, but at scale, then it becomes different. Then it becomes a mass defrauding of the public of whatever country is buying this tuna fish. And then we decide that it matters enough to bring this class action. So this kind of gets this philosophical distinction, or philosophical literature on vagueness, which I tried not to fall too deep into this rabbit hole. But we have this way of talking about vagueness and thinking about when, okay, we start with a grain of sand, we keep adding grains of sand. At what point does it become a heap? At what point does this difference in degree become a difference in kind? And again, I think having the language of orders of magnitude could be one way to think about that without having to directly address the problems of vagueness. You could just ignore them. Okay, finally, I'm really excited with this principle that you introduced of start with scale. I think that's an extremely useful concept and one that could really change the way that a lot of people address problems of technology. And the current examples you give are network effects, social media, and privacy predominantly. But I think as you expand the paper, you could also talk about how much this matters for algorithmic decision making, which is in there a little, but I think could be in there a lot more, and predictive analytics or finance. So Gary Gensler and Lily Bailey have a 2020 paper where they talk about systemic risk to the financial system of various financial actors having access to the same data and then making decisions in concert. And so this kind of herding behavior is one thing that can potentially destabilize the financial system, because if all of us are pulling the same easily accessible public data and we're all making microsecond level decisions from our fancy data centers, but we all have access to the same data, we're probably going to make similar decisions, and this can lead to these split-second, sloshing around in concert, which can make the financial system less stable. Okay, so those are just additional emergent problems that might be interesting. And thanks again for the paper and for encouraging us to start with scale.
Thank you very much. I love having a philosopher being able to sort of work through the various aspects of your paper. So to begin, first I want to say that my co-author Mark McKenna would have loved to have been here, but was unable to make it due to some family circumstances. And it would have been his first read robots, and so he sends his apologies. The second thing is, you've correctly noted, this is incredibly useful feedback for me, and you've correctly noted that there are lots of difficult classification problems between what is just more or what is different, and how do we sort of think about that. This paper, Mark and I have been working on this paper for maybe like 2.5 or 3 years. And one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for us is that we keep talking ourselves out of when we think something is different versus when it's more. And so we started off actually your paper with Deborah Hellman and Kristen Thomasen's work on sidewalk robots, and some of Ryan Taylor's work on law and technology stuff is really what got us thinking about this problem of what happens if we just sort of let these technologies go. And so I'd love to hear more about ways in which we might impose order on that, and whether, even if it matters, maybe if it's okay, if there may be overlapping Venn diagrams for purposes of law, how do we cash that out, which is really where I think Mark and I are trying to focus on. And I also will just go ahead and say, before we go straight to questions, I also realized that one of the places in which we really want to build out in the future is figuring out why the law tends to just look at scale as more, and what sort of specific drivers and sort of incentives they have to do that versus a more sustained approach of, sort of sussing out. It's probably not just under sophistication, but there's got to be some reason why that's a general tendency in the law to not be sophisticated about it. So thank you very much for that excellent feedback, and I'll be following up. So you can keep the queue, and so anyone now, the way that it works, if you have questions, just stand up and please come down and start the queue, and we'll go ahead and go. I figured Neil would probably be the first one to get us started.
You're invisible, Margot. We're just pretending.
Yeah. These are, Margaret, you missed it. These are pretend microphones.
They're actually in the room.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So it's such a luxury to be able to ask Woody a question at a conference. That'd be weird. Well, I can't promise that. So I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, because we actually haven't talked about this, which is bizarre. How much of the scale is different scale is more collapses down into the qualitative quantitative distinction? Because I know that both in the paper and in Katie's comments, you're sort of naturally using those terms. And so I guess my question is, does the scale is more, scale is different framing add anything to the classic qualitative quantitative distinction? And if not, why not just rely on that? Second question, how much of this is because I was struggling in reading the paper to try and wrap my mind around how much of this is a critique of the ideology of scale that we hear coming from technology, which I think is probably what prompted you guys to write the paper in the first place, and how much of this is a sort of value neutral, analytical typology taxonomy of how we should think about scale. Because I think at some points in the paper you're correctly pushing back on, well, you know, at scale we can't do this nonsense we've heard from digital technology companies for 20 years now. And at other times there's almost this like philosophical or analytical construction of a set of concepts. Finally, this will shock you. I want to know how this applies retroactively, or different directions. So one direction would be, and there's hints of this in the paper, how does scale apply to human cognition, right? So what is it's a very regulation of firms oriented analysis, but there are hints, including the quote from our paper, that you correctly critique, about scale within a human mind, and like we said, you know, control doesn't scale for an ordinary consumer. How does it work at a micro level? And then across time, how much of this is about digital tech, and you call them technologies at times, is it you almost essentialize them, which I think is just a language thing. How much of this is about digital technologies and is specific to that versus all technologies? So like industrial production of canned foods operates at scale. Does it tell us anything retrospectively about how we should have regulated, you know, consumer products or mass-produced toys or shoes, which of course are also themselves technologies, versus how much of this is robots and AI and platforms and software, and there's a lot of vaccines in the paper, which I suspect is the mark. So those are my thoughts.
As usual, a concise question from Neil. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. We've got quite a few, so I'm just going to answer it quickly. And I think, Neil, I can actually answer, maybe oversimplify all three of your questions by saying your instincts about what we were trying to do in the paper, I think, are right, which is we started from a critique of the way in which scale gets deployed. So if you'll notice at the beginning of the paper, we cite a lot about the way in which the literal word scale gets deployed, and it's not always sort of clear what they mean with respect to the relationship there. And in a way, maybe we were a little bit motivated by the kind of critique, and some of it which comes from your book, around the idea of innovation, which gets deployed in sort of similar ways discursively to accomplish ends, right? It's convenient to deploy scale when you don't want to do something, right? Or lawmakers often sort of scale seems like an insurmountable idea to approaching regulating a problem. And so what we really, the goal of this project was really to be trying to be both a clarification and a slightly demystifying approach to scale. And what we wanted to move to was what you actually identified, which was this sort of value neutral way of thinking about the relationship between the more of which you do something and the effects that it has, which actually does track along quantitative, qualitative lines, or distinctions in differences in magnitude versus differences in kind. The reason this is related to digital technologies is because this is a We Robot conference, and we had to sort of frame it in a way that made sense with this conference. It does apply broadly. That's less of what we're concerned about, and actually what Mark and I's hope is for. is so that people might actually, in other areas, say, oh, here's an interesting paper, sort of breaking apart scale as a conceptual matter, and they can apply it in other areas. Like, we're obviously not going to write a paper about vaccines, for example, but that's clearly a relevant issue. But where this does hit the area of legal technologies, and this is getting to, I think, of what Ryan is thinking a lot about in terms of what is sort of law and technology generally, is one of the chief virtues of specifically digital technologies over a lot of other technologies that are resource intensive, is that a lot of people say they're better because they scale, right? So software, wide-scale software deployments tend to scale in ways that non-networks, non-software technologies may not, or apply in a different sort of dynamic. And so there actually is something specific to digital technologies, and maybe even specific automated technologies, which also have a labor savings that also enable scale, right, in other different ways, that we were sort of interested about the unique question for that. So, sorry, a characteristically concise answer for myself.
Hi, so I'm going to do, I think, 3 or 4 things. I'm going to applaud you for this intervention, tell you what I think you should be reading, and then ask a provocative question that's maybe not a real question, but indicates my thoughts, and then give you a real question.
I love it. Wow, give me a roadmap for the questions too, which is amazing.
So the applauding you for this intervention, I think that the move this paper makes that's pretty important is to take something that's already there in the literature, bubbling up in a bunch of different places, make it super clear and potentially super concise. So I highly recommend you stick with the high-level language and keeping it concise. Okay, that said, there's a bunch of really detailed, complicated conversations that I want you to read and engage with. So I think that the paper would benefit from engaging with some of the literature on the analogies between data privacy and environmental law, which has already made this collective societal level move. And that's Michael Frumkin had a piece about this ages ago. Andrew, where's Andrew? Andrew's work on impact assessments is a move in a similar direction. Omri Ben Shachar has a piece called Data Pollution, which makes a very similar but like law and econ-based argument for why this should be seen as an issue of societal level and collective level harms, and how we could turn to the toolkit of environmental law to incorporate some of those, better fit regulatory tools. And then the other thing I point you to is the weird stuff that's going on in content moderation right now. Jack Balkin has a paper really recently called, I think, Free Speech versus the First Amendment, where he bemoans the move from individual constitutional rights to what he calls heap, which I was laughing when Katie used the word heap, heap-type framing of the problem, which is looking at stuff as epidemiological, population-level harm, which in his view erases the constitutional rights. Okay, so that's all the stuff that I think is really important for you to be reading and engaging with, maybe in the footnotes, but maybe it helps some of the concise framing on the top. Now to my provocative question, which is maybe not such a real question, but indicates my thoughts. Isn't this just saying we should move to administrative law or ex-ante regulation? Right? Like the 2 options that we have in the toolkit is individual rights, largely ex post, or ex-ante regulation, largely centralized command and control. And so isn't that just what you're doing here? And then that brings me to my probably more productive question, which is what do you think gets lost in a move to scale? Right? Like there are going to be benefits. I'm not sure that the pros and cons conversation is going to look all that different from an admin law versus ex post litigation conversation, but I'd like to know from you whether you two have thought ahead at all to the point of the question of what's going to get lost in this move.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. That is incredibly helpful. And I need to think a lot about, we haven't actually sort of gotten to that point yet, which is about what gets lost. And that's a really important intervention, and not have to get bookmark and think hard about. Whether we're just arguing for an administrative approach. My instinct is yes, in cases where it makes sense, but also thinking about the potential failures of enforcement at scale, which might then counsel some sort of complementary approach. And if that is what we're saying, then maybe we should come out and say that concisely as well. Because there's so many people, I want to just pause, but thank you very much for that. And also thank you for the roadmap, which helped me structure it myself as I was taking in notes. Thanks, Monica.
Hi. Well, first off, thank you. I thought it was a really.
Can you speak up, please? Sorry, we can't hear.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. First off, thank you. I think
Oh,
it
maybe we
was
do.
this paper really put words to things that had been intuitive for many of us for a while, thinking about individual versus societal level harms of technology. And so I think this is going to inform that debate and is amazing. The only thing that I was struggling with a bit was the 4 categories. And so the one that I didn't find very convincing was scale intelligence assumptions about the cost benefit analysis. And I know in the paper you say we know it's a subset of category 2, but we think it's important to distinguish it. But for me, actually, it wasn't a subset of category 2, it was more a mix of category 2 and 3. Like basically, you know, the problem is different, and also as a result, the solution is different. And so I felt like the 4 categories were not exactly on the same level, if you know what I mean. Yes, that's the only thing. I hope it's helpful. I don't have a solution to this, so I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's great, excellent, thank you so much. We'll consider that. And if people do want to grab the lapel microphones, I'll also bring mine over here, and then I'll yell. Really, thanks.
I'm happy to. Projecting is not good. Hi. So I guess there have been some big scale comments, and I'm going to make smaller scale comments.
See what you did there.
So one is really small, and then there are 3 which are smaller, but I think grouped together are one slightly bigger point. The really small thing is, I think it's probably worth distinguishing in the definition between the noun scale, the phrase at scale, and the verb scale, because I feel like those 3 things have distinctly different meanings that might be useful for you. I don't think they're central, but I think it's worth parsing that or pulling those apart a little bit. The 3 slightly bigger points all fall together under the phrase of don't pick fights that you don't need to, which I try to follow and frequently fail, which is, I think there are 2 examples that just rang like I just wanted to fight them. And if you want to fight the example, they're probably not doing the exact thing. One of them is vaccines and herd immunity, which I totally agree with you is an awesome point. It's just a lousy point with COVID, because we're like, everybody's gotten COVID, and we don't have herd immunity, and there are lots of vaccinations, and it just, people are going to argue with you about that. So I like measles. People will argue with you about that as well, but the people that are arguing with you are really dumb, so, sorry. I say that, I apologize. I think, anyway, it's different. The second is the example of content, or not, the takedown notices, which at least in the introduction felt to me, I was like, oh yeah, this is totally a case where scale is different. And then I was like, oh wait, no, that's an example of scale is more, I don't get that at all, because it feels like content moderation and the existence of an automated system and the default from takedown to not takedown feels like the world has changed, and that's very different from just more of this is happening. And then the last point is about linearity, and I would just encourage you to abandon the idea of linearity. I don't know what I think you should replace it with. I'm guessing probably something like monotonicity or maybe continuity, but I just know that every law and economics reader of the paper is going to say, look, when we talk about efficiencies of scale, that's not linear. No production function is linear. Costs aren't linear. They're going to just be so difficult in that way that they get. And I love them so much, but you'll just have to fight with them. You don't need to, because I don't think that's essential to your point either. Super fun paper, so thanks.
Thank you so much, I appreciate that. I will not, we will work on not picking fights that we don't need to pick, so thank you.
Can you, if you're asking a question, briefly introduce yourself? Like, I don't know who this guy is.
Oh, yes, thank you so much, yeah, just apologies. That's custom with Robot, and I realized we didn't actually even introduce ourselves, we just sort of started talking, so I'm Woody Hartzog, by the way. School in fall, so, I mean, if everyone else good, and Katie, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, belatedly, I'm Katie Creel. I'm at Northeastern, cross-pointed in philosophy and computer science.
Ryan Kalo, University of Washington. So you and I had a conversation, Woody, last night about, I'm not going to rehash that conversation, but I wanted to mention, I think that there's something interesting to be said about enforcement thresholds, I realize. So stuff at page 31 where you talk about a bill that quote unquote targets dominant players, it has a sort of language of almost antitrust associated with it, but we've seen a lot of legislation that doesn't kick in until you have a certain number of users and so on, right? And then in addition to that, and the idea there is, hey, let's not dampen competition by making it impossible for really small startups to gain scale, right? To sort of enter into the wealth of networks, right? I mean, I almost feel like maybe a citation or two to Banquet would be helpful in evidencing that. But anyway, and so you have that possibility. And then even if you don't have a formal mechanism in a statute to start to regulate when scale is reached, right? You have just the fact of the matter of the FTC enforcement power, which tends to be very, very bad smaller players that do egregious things, and every household name company, right? If you're huge, the FTC is going to get you into a consent decree, and it doesn't matter whether it's security or passport or it's, it doesn't matter what it is. Ultimately, they're gonna get you into consent decree because they know that by doing that, they can really affect the market. You know what I mean? And so I just feel like that part of 31 moves a little too fast.
Yeah.
The second thing is a very just small comment, which is that I just find it sad that Mark McKenna is claiming it's family issues when in fact he is afraid to face me in ping pong.
That's true. He actually texted me this morning. I was like, well, I'm really glad I got to avoid playing Ryan in ping pong. I know it's a right. Thank you.
Great project.
Thank you. In the interest of time, just because I want to keep us relatively on schedule here, I'm going to just briefly respond. If I do so, it is not because I think your questions are uninteresting or not very meaningful. I'm taking lots of notes. I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask a question.
Hi, Jesse Wu, I'm a master's student at Computer Science at Columbia. So one quick point is I think you may have missed a kind of subtle category in the scale is different part, which is that where scale actually draws out some like emergent property in the technology. So like the difference between GPT-2 and GPT-3 is a couple orders of magnitude in terms of number of parameters, and there's additional things that went into that technology. Like largely, it's like bigger model, you get things that you just don't see in smaller models. Right? And so, sort of along that line, I'm wondering if you thought about or looked at any of the kind of distributed computing literature, which is all about large-scale computing clusters that are operating in the cloud and how they fail in interesting ways. How you can look at kind of resource choke points to tell you about what's going on in these systems. So that might be useful.
That's great. Excellent. Thank you. We have not looked at that, and we will.
Paul Catlin, representing myself. I wanted to express my appreciation for making the axis now traversable with scale as smaller rather than always scale as larger. And interested in your thoughts, that gave me sort of the thought process of scale also always helpful to add a new dimension, a new axis as soon as you've got a big one. Scale velocity rather than just magnitude. So the difference between, say, word processing to typewriters to printing press to whatever, which is the incremental changes in getting our ideas written down, versus this sort of historically sudden change of, in the last 200 years, suddenly a lot of humans are no longer interacting with animals, or very many animals, and suddenly all the technology and all the technical know-how that was daily in interacting with creatures is gone.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I'll think more about the relationship between velocity and magnitude.
Hi, Andrew Sells, UCLA School of Law. So I really like the intervention to make the point that lawmakers need to focus on scale is great. Just a couple things I wanted to sort of ask or provoke about. So one of the things you said was that you want to focus on why law thinks about this a certain way, but actually this, based on some of Katie's comments, right, it seems to be kind of a fact of how humans conceptualize everything, so the sand versus the heat problem, quantum physics, right? But actually quantum physics is interesting because all the formulas have to, when they get larger, have to actually simplify down, so they are kind of more at number than different. Anyway,
You've lost it already, but you need to
yeah, sorry.
that.
This is what happens when I don't write down my comments. So anyway, I guess the first thing I wanted to ask was, if this is a fact about how humans conceptualize everything and it comes up in all these different spheres, what does it mean if it's not unique to law, right? If it's not something that happens only in law, does that affect how you care about it on a normative level, right? Other than the observation that this happens, it doesn't change your observation that lawmakers should notice that this happens and care. But if you're trying to come up with some sort of normative theory, if it's everywhere, then that changes. The other thing I mentioned to you yesterday that I was thinking about enforcement, and I wonder, I was thinking two very similar examples that might have different sort of valences to your argument, and again, I don't know why, but I'm just going to present them. One, think of like a repeated TCPA violation, where there's a statutory scheme of $5,000 per violation, and on the one hand, you have a company that does this, that after 2 or 3 violations, or maybe after like 30, they're gonna go bankrupt, and so there's no money. And so they, like literally as a physical matter, cannot beyond a certain scale pay out, therefore scale is enforced to be different by reality of the world.
Yeah.
Versus a judge that decides, normatively, this company that did 10,000 incidents of this one statutory damages shouldn't pay 10,000 times the fine. Right, which would be a common result of an incredibly repeated statutory damage scheme. They would say, oh, they have enough punishment with only $1 million instead of 50 million. Those seem different, but I don't know if they are meaningfully different to you. If it's like a fact of the universe versus a normative judgment that some human makes, that scale should be different. And I'm curious what you think about that. I guess the last point I want to make is I actually want to kind of disagree with what Nicholson said about linearity. I think linearity is actually super important to your scale at more point. And when we talk about efficiencies of scale, that's kind of a scale at a different point in a certain way, in that it changes the function, right? It makes it nonlinear. And so maybe that's a third category, right? In which scale is not different, but becomes nonlinear, and that itself is actually kind of separately important. And so maybe rather than getting rid of the linearity point, think a little bit more about how it affects your argument or the intuition.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I think it goes back to Neil's point about are we attacking the discourse of scale as it is deployed in technology law, which is a different thing from the entire sort of law's approach to the concept of scale. I will tell you, our instincts probably started with the former, thinking about the way in which scale sort of plays a large role in our modern debates around information automated technologies. But we may have to wrestle with the second one in order to get the first one right, and that's a really important intervention. So I'll think harder about that. Obviously it goes without saying that all the good stuff in the paper that you liked, I wrote. And everything bad that was not good, Mark wrote.
Hi, I'm Kristen Thomasen from UBC, but I'm actually representing Sue Gluck from Microsoft. She is honored to say hello, and she has a wonderful question, so I'm really happy I get to share in the asking of it. So she says she loves the paper, 2 exclamation points. In section 4, the notion of lawmakers periodically revisiting rules is laudable, but perhaps not realistic. We're waiting still for ECPA reform. I, as a Canadian, don't know what that is, but I trust you do. Do we have any examples of revisiting other than perhaps where the FTC did an updated rulemaking for COPA? It seems so rare.
That is a great question. We actually do have examples where there are legal provisions built in, and I know that Neil's about to jump up and yell sunset provisions put into law. So there are, I mean, this is actually a really good point about the sort of reality of enforcement that a couple of people have already made, which is, you know, how do we actually change things on the ground? But one of the things that Neil and I have advocated for in other work is thinking about implementing sunset provisions and rules where it requires a revisiting after a set number of periods, or it just lapses. And I think that that's, you know, that maybe is a good starting place for that. But I also get that it's easy to, there are pitfalls with that approach as well. And one of the things that Mark and I want to be really clear about is some of the negative effects of forcing lawmakers to revisit over and over, because each hard fault, and I think about this actually from the perspective of facial recognition technologies, which is the legislation around which I've been somewhat involved in. Every time you put a possible relitigation of problems on the table, it's another opportunity to water it down as well. And so we'd have to sort of think through how that interplay goes. But please convey to Sue, thank you very much for the question.
I will send back your answer too.
Excellent.
Hi, Rory Van Loo at Boston University, and I really liked this. You know, I found my mind racing in all kinds of different directions for applications. The importance is clear. It seems like there are, in some ways, two very different projects here, or animating goals. One is about precision, and one's about comprehensiveness. And we want people to be precise when they use the word scale, or really any term. You know, Ryan, Kayla, and I were talking about incentives and the sloppy use of the word incentives in tort law, and like there are all kinds of examples of like precision, right? And then the comprehensive project is, in my mind, something that is in some ways a broader theme that you're kind of tackling one instantiation of. And so you have all kinds of legal scholarship that's arguing, you know, don't ignore externalities, don't forget about the broader societal inequality elements of what's happening. I like the disinformation example in your paper, but so if the goal is comprehensiveness, there's so many, one question I had is it better to just say that rather than to identify different, you know, you want to look at scale for these two reasons, and should we just instead say we just need to be comprehensive or take a big picture approach to the harms and everything that's going on? And one of the, you know, and this is a little bit responsive to Margot's point about, are you just saying we need to go to administrative regulation? And I think it's actually in some ways broader, because administrative agencies and ex-ante regulation is often subject to the same critique of not looking broadly enough, right? And so, and your three recommendations at the end are terrific, and they're also just very sensible for a whole variety of other reasons, right? Because there's innovation, because the harms are hard to predict and they evolve and so on, because there's political economy capturing Congress, for a variety of reasons we want to reevaluate from time to time, because we know businesses are going to whittle away at the laws, the regulations that are passed. Anyhow, so I just think that this is kind of fitting into something broader, and I'm struggling a little bit with, you know, how much do we need to attack this in the scale context for the precision versus making a broader point about let's be comprehensive as we think about these problems. As a quick side note, there's also a macro versus microeconomic whole debate there, where the macroeconomists, like there are like two of them in the legal academy, are saying, hey, let's focus on macro, not just micro when we think about the law. Your discussion fits into that.
That's really, really helpful, Rory. Thank you so much. My instinct is the second you said it, I think that's a really wise insight. It's probably comprehensiveness is where we started, even though we use the language of precision, and we should be clear about that. Thank you.
Can you keep the next two short, because we are at time?
Oh, yes, again, I will not respond, I will just say, thank you.
Yes or no question.
Okay.
Super. Thanks, Woody, for the paper. Tim O'Brien, University of Washington. Did you and or Mark give any consideration to technology disruption as a useful construct in kind of try to advance ideas of accelerants and impediments to scale? I was thinking about the car example. You have this incumbent technology called engines. EVs are disruptive. Incumbents enjoy incumbency by virtue of their scale. People use it like it's got massive adoption. And disruptive technologies and unforeseen harms are constant companions throughout history. And law and policy, as you said, do a poor job of getting in front of that. So, did you think about it? If not, why not? Useful, not useful? Just 3 comments.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the short answer is I think that we didn't think about it explicitly, but as you describe it, of course, it was really animating a lot of our concerns, and so we should engage with them more explicitly. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Mark, I'm doing AI ethics at DT. I haven't actually read your paper, but it sounds really good. But,
it's amazing. It's the best paper you've ever read.
So I've been in conversations recently with some regulators over how we regulate near frontier technologies like brain computer interfaces and that sort of thing. So we're looking at, do we need like international regulatory sandboxes to encourage safe testing or certification schemes? But when you're looking at this sort of stuff, should we be thinking also like the scale and long-term implications of this technology? How can we do that when it's just so nascent and we don't really understand, particularly like the disruption in the field?
That's a great question. And it's something that we'll have to think about, and particularly what is sort of foreseeable if it only emerges at scale. How do you then get an insight into it for that?
Can you help me? There's actually a request.
Right, yeah, no. Yeah, please help me, right. We'll have to talk later about that, but that's a good question. Thank you very much, I appreciate it.
All right, let's thank Woody.
All right, hello everyone. If I can get started now. I'm Lionel Robert at the University of Michigan, the School of Information and Robotics Department. And the paper we're going to be talking about in this moment is Toward Equitable, Agile Research and Development of AI and Robotics. The author is here, Andrew. So,
yeah, I'm. Yeah, I'm Andrew Hundt. I'm a postdoc at Creel University, and yeah.
So I'm going to, I'll talk about the paper at a high level, and some of the objectives, what they're trying to accomplish, and then I'll give my sort of critique or advice on the big picture issues, and then I will narrow it down to specific. So, just a step back here, we're all aware, or not, we should be that software is developed by teams of people, in many cases not teams, that engage in a deliberative product development process. Right? We also are aware that a lot of AI and robotic systems can amplify existing biases and prejudices. And what they offer in this book is a practical method for project teams to organize, operationalize what they consider to be the most promising approaches to detecting and addressing issues of fairness, equity, accountability, and ethical problems. And the idea is to address these things early on in the development of the system because they're easier to fix and more effective. To accomplish this, they adopt the agile development process called Scrum. And I think the basic underlying assumptions of this approach is similar to other ones, that more representative data or forms of participation will produce less biased systems. I think to their credit, they go a little bit further than that by, because you can have more participation and representation in these teams, and if you don't do something to give them an equal voice, you still can produce the same outcomes, right? So they go a little bit further, say, okay, here's how you can be sure that that increased representation leads to have an equal voice. The paper reviews several literature, different literature on this, and proposes these steps by essentially infusing their recommendations into the typical Scrum process. Right? So let me talk about some of the issues that I have or concerns. One is, one embedded assumption is that the designer and participants can foresee all the potential harms of the technology, which I think is not this case. That's one thing. And it also speaks to a bigger problem that I see not just in this paper, but this approach in general. The assumption is that technology companies see a problem and they develop a technology solution. And you can criticize that in and of itself, but I think that's a faulty assumption. I think what happens in many cases is that they develop what they believe is a technology solution, and they hope you will find a problem for them, right? So a perfect example is Pepper the robot, which is pretty popular. Pepper the robot is probably not really good for anything, but they use it for a lot of things, right? It's a platform, you can appropriate it to a lot of it, but it's not really good for any one thing, right? It's like a halfway solution for a lot of things, right? The same thing with ChatGPT, where the people who developed that almost certainly didn't imagine it would be appropriated in the ways it is now. And next year, people will be appropriating that technologies in ways that we don't foresee it right now. Because the most widely used technologies are essentially platforms that give what I call users flexible appropriation, right? These are things that they develop and say, let's see how people are going to use it. So if those are the most popular and widely used technologies, this approach to solving that problem is going to be pretty limited, right? Now, ironically, the more accessible the technology is, the bigger the problem this is, right? So we did a tour of Boston Dynamics, and they have ways of locking down their technology to ensure that it's being used appropriately, right? That's less able to do in something that's widely available and easy to purchase, if not cheap, right? So, in the workshop the other day I attended, there's this growing recognition that technology is not neutral, but there's less of acknowledgement or a recognition that humans are also not neutral, right? That people will appropriate the technologies based upon their own intentions and motives, right? And the same technology can be appropriated in many different ways. And to me, this doesn't sort of address that fundamental issue. And this is not just a criticism or concern about this paper. So this is about the approach of all, which is the idea that we can go retroactively, go back and address these problems by anticipating all possible uses, when in many cases that's just not possible. So that's the big picture. I'll bring it down narrowly to the actual paper. As an author and editor, it's not quite clear to me what the paper, what's novel relative to the existing approaches. So that's a lot of papers that have put forth similar approaches. So it's not quite clear to me how this is different than those. And two, there's a lot of overclaiming in the paper. This is so I'll give you an example. One comment in the paper says, we connect literature and lenses of analysis from areas such as ethical software, systems engineering, cognitive science, stats, human-computer interaction, history, psychology, feminism, disabled, Black, and science and technology studies. I'm thinking, that'll be books. It'll be like books, right? And the thing is, when I read that statement as an editor, first thing I thought was, I've been that person, right? You don't want to be that person. Because you just get somebody else from any one of those areas going to read that paper and they're going to immediately get kind of upset. So I would pull back some of the claims. And in a larger context, I think you do a really good job at bringing forth the idea of here's a problem, here's a possible way that we can think about it. I think there are some cases where this could be very useful. In particular, I think this approach is probably, the actual strength lies in the deployment of the technology in a given community. So I can see, for example, if someone wanted to build security robots, however they wanted to build them, if they wanted to have them in my neighborhoods, we could do this participatory design to determine how they would deploy, right? That would make, to me, a lot more sense, a lot more effective. So one thing concerns me about this approach, and this is not just you, I made this myself, in retrospect, is that I wonder to what degree if these approaches provide legal protection for companies who say, look, I've done my due diligence, I've had X amount of people on the team, and they all like the software, so you can't hold me accountable, right? And the second issue, I think we all are missing the obligation of the user. It's really easy to go off to these tech companies and say, look what you did. It seems to be hard to point to the individual users who misappropriate these technologies in ways that, to be fair, it's hard to anticipate. So I'll stop there, and I'll open it up to any questions. You need a microphone? Or?
I don't know, can people hear me okay? Okay, great. So I was very excited to see this work, because I think it's, sorry, thank you. My name's Anastasia Ostrowski. I'm a postdoc at MIT Media Lab. So I really enjoyed the topic of this paper. I think some ways to strengthen it, specifically with the figure you have, you go into a lot of depth on for each phase what could be brought into that, but I don't really see as much of that tie-in in the paper. So I think you could kind of, in the area where you break out the phases, really go into depth on the methodologies you highlight in the figure, why would they be ideal, and how is this supporting equity? Because the translation of those methods from academia to industry can be very different, and there's different drivers in each of those spaces. For just thinking about some background work, so you kind of loop together participatory design, human-computer interaction, user-centered design, and interaction design. Those are all really, really big fields. And each of those fields are very different depending if you're talking about robotics or AI. So for example, specifically to robotics, which is the area that I work most in, there is a lot of works that I felt were missing. So you have the paper by Katie Winkle, but there are kind of broader claims you can draw from that work or contributions, such as the questions that are promoting more equitable thought in HRI. There's also Christina Zaga's work that looks at like forecasting and futuring and how that can support plurality of voices in the work. And then I've also done work on design justice in HRI. So there are kind of these foundational movements that are happening in the past few years to really bring equity into that space. And where I see sort of the novelty of some of this work is thinking about, okay, most of these are in a research context, how do we start bringing this into industry? And so I think that could be solving some of the novelty area that we were talking about a little earlier.
You want a chance to respond to that? You look good.
I mean, that all sounds great. Let's see. So, what was did I miss the question? Sorry.
No, I was just giving some thoughts on organization.
You wanted to respond to that, or any questions you have to follow up to that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I'd like to get the names of some of those references. And yeah, those are very good points. I've been, when I've gotten feedback, I've been getting some like competing, like, oh, it's getting too expansive in like going to every detail of every subfield, and then like, and then the paper gets too big, and then oh, now you're missing some parts. So it's been a bit of a tough trade-off to sort of like get a decent balance where I like get at least the high level of things, but also, you know, have at least one substantive point on each and how they're relevant to actually running a whole project.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm happy to talk after
Yeah,
as well, because
yeah,
I
really.
also run into this issue of like robotics and AI is such a big field. Like, which one are you gearing towards?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Next, I don't know who's next. Need a microphone?
Probably for the best. Look at a tone that is beyond many people's range of hearing. Today, Paul Calhoun, representing myself and with my involved system engineering hat on, so I am used to the many questions of people who are seeing something moving everything to the left side of the cost curve for a promised benefit to the right. And we discussed, full disclosure, discussed this a lot with Andrew on the bus yesterday, so I'm going to ask a happy question. You had some questionnaires at the end, participant checklists, which were very comprehensive, and I wondered what you thought of in terms of the cadence for those, where they belong in the overall process.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in somewhere around like quarterly perhaps, since probably would take, 5 to 10 minutes. For some people, if someone goes into more detail, it can take longer. And then having the option of submitting at any time so if there's a particular incident where someone, doing the guidance of the project or someone who's a participant it encounters an incident, like they can then submit feedback on like web form or whatever immediately. So that can be thought of by the people who are running the platform.
Hi, Cindy Graham from Oregon State University. I'm actually just going to plug a friend of mine. I'm going to add to your pile. I'm going to plug some work at Oregon State. There's a woman named Margaret Burnett, and she's done this work broadly called Gender Mag or Social Mag. So if you search Gender Mag, it will show up. And she's actually taken it into Microsoft. So she's spent a sabbatical at Microsoft, so it's been sort of industry tested. But her basic idea behind that is to model, have the people in the development team model particular people in the development cycle in order to understand like could they actually use this interface or not. So I guess I'm just going to add to your, I totally understand that this is really hard to fit. How do you do inclusive design inside one paper? But I will just add that as another place to go look. And one thing I really like about it is it's focused on what you should do and a little less on identifying problems. And so I really like that part about the work.
Hi, Jesse Wu, Columbia. So I guess my question broadly is why, like what is unique about AI and robotics that they need to have this paper and, you know, a sort of a way of describing participatory design, and how is that different than just we should have good design processes that we want to have everywhere in software. We want to talk to users. We want to, you know, solicit feedback. I know it's a challenging way. I'm sort of hoping to kind of draw out, you know, what is it about the paper, and I might suggest that some things are that, you know, maybe there's scale issues that we're worried about for AI, or there's safety issues that we're worried about for robotics, or, you know, it seems like that's what I would like to see is more of the motivation and what makes this like unique. You know, because I do think there are unique contributions here. So that's
Yeah, I guess some of the things are that in particular robots, one of the differences between, say, typical AI systems and robots with AI is they'll physically act on the inputs in a way that AI systems might say to financial transactions, which does have an impact on the world, but that can be sometimes with large delays reversible in some ways in a way that, you know, a physical action is not. Or if it's, say, some surveillance application, most of the time there's like a person who then is like, oh, this is the person who's our target, but then that's like a human check, like this person is not the one that the system didn't match correctly. And so that's probably stopped a number of incidents, which if a robot was then carrying that out, that safeguard wouldn't necessarily be there.
yeah, that makes sense. And also this reminds me of just your point about like ethical logs. I think so. Maybe another contribution is that ethical logs are just like audit trails, right? Or you know, just keeping good records. But maybe it's a way of sort of speaking to engineers in their language, kind of like translating these practices.
I mean, the real answer to that question is that this is we robots, and this is why it's important.
Hi, I'm Sean Garrity from Home Depot, although these are my own views, do not represent the views of Home Depot. I enjoy the paper because I'm in industry and I'm a software practitioner and a user experience designer, so I've seen a lot of these frameworks like the Universal Design Framework from Microsoft. I have one thought and one question is, I feel like a lot of small startups and even some large companies may not adopt this because they see it as overhead that just slows them down for a company that kind of model to move fast and break things. So this would not fit with that model. The question that I'm curious about though is equity law, would that provide any kind of legal protection? To show, here's our decision charts, here's the checks we made. I'm just curious about like how.
That's actually one of the things I'm like hoping for, is that there's some like, legal insights that I could gain into what could be the risks and benefits or ways of like enforcing better outcomes from a legal perspective, and that's an area where I'm not in law. I just have some curiosity. So yeah, that's an excellent point that I'm interested to expand upon, but don't really have the expertise for it at the moment.
Thank you. I'm Peter Sarno, the New School, and University of Washington this year. Thank you for this paper, and thank you for the responses as well. I think there's been a lot of discussions around how to integrate participation, participatory design, these other design features into AI and machine learning and robots. But I wonder if there's like a fundamental tension, particularly around agility and participation. And agility kind of has two meanings. On the one hand, it's flexibility, but it's also about speed. And to kind of follow this previous question about, we want to develop things really fast and move technology, and that's obviously in the development cycle an important thing. But my own kind of analysis of participatory design is that it matters a lot how you do the participation, what points you're integrating, what the intentions of the organizations are in putting that into participation into a design process. And I just wonder if agility is at odds in some ways with participation, that you're trying to speed things up when in fact what you want to do with participation is going to slow things down and have many different points of contact with the participation. And then thus the sort of ultimate danger that I think the discussant said, which was we just have these kind of toolkits, and it seems like we can just use that toolkit, and as long as we use this toolkit to build something, it's got to be a good thing, or we're not liable for it, or something like that. And that really kind of the point of the participation is to always have some kind of reflection and engagement with users, and that it's not a bounded sort of quick process, but in some sense deeper and more expansive.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and that's like, I think that's sort of one of the limitations I tried to highlight, in that there'd have to be buy-in from a team, and there's participation can take time. I think it's sort of at least trying to take what organizations do now and help it be a bit better than before, since many are just like not even considering this. So, and try to be a bit more practical in terms of, what can we get organizations to do to get to a better place. That doesn't mean it's definitely not going to solve anything. Some of these are open-ended problems that will exist for everybody's lives. So yeah, I think those are very good points, and that those are just have to be some of the limitations like at this time. And I'm definitely open to ideas of how to address that in a way that is actionable and stuff.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Joanna Gunaway from Eastern University, from the CS department, and I really like this. I like all the efforts that people are making, including this paper, and trying to build tools and the things that we use in technologies much more equitably. But I think something that I was looking at, especially after reading the title, I was really excited about an operational sort of toolkit for researchers to build and to actually develop these new ideas within AI and robotics more ethically and equitably. But the sort of operational method that was proposed, I felt like it was still operationally very much geared towards industry, whether that's industry research or industry product development. And I think that's fine, because that's where Agile and Scrum comes from anyways and is intended for. But I think what I was really hoping to see, especially for kind of related to the previous two questions, where research teams, especially within academia, just don't have the overhead. They don't have a lot of people. They don't have these roles like in Table 2 where you have a product owner and a Scrum Master, and you may have a PI, but I think having some sort of mapping, or at least some sort of consideration for how these teams, particularly research teams, especially if they're working on things within AI and robotics, but not necessarily including the
HCI or HRI elements of it, to really stop and think about these things and how they can customize that to their workflows. Just because they have much less structured teams, and so I was looking for that and how I could actually try to convert that into a research team that may have maybe 1 or 2 PhD students working on something, and maybe they do have daily meetings where they meet in the lab, but trying to really understand which pieces they could use. And I know it said in the methodology that it was the proposed method is flexible and intended to be customized to a specific project, but I think some operational recommendations on how to either abstract that or to make it more feasible to be learned for smaller teams, whether that's in industry or academia, could be really useful.
Yeah, I'm actually planning on, I've got a project planned where I'm at CMU and it's going to be a pretty small team, so hopefully we'll have a follow-up on a more like practical, like this is what we did and how things went. That actually answers that question, but that's future research.
Hi, I'm Katie Salegi. I'm from the University of Manitoba, and I appreciate the challenge that you're responding to because it's really hard to come up with these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches that are going to be appealing to people. I'm an engineer, I'm also a lawyer, and these people don't always speak the same languages. And so what I saw you trying to do in this piece was use a language that is exciting and appealing to that startup community, right? To those technologists, to people who you want to move fast and break things. And so using that agile language feels appealing and feels innovative and feels fresh, I think, from a transdisciplinary approach. Where I think it struggles, and I would be happy to talk more about this with you later, but my understanding of an agile framework is that it really privileges and kind of centers the idea of failure and being able to fail fast and fail often and fixing the things as you go, right? Like the whole idea of having the research sprint, of having the daily scrum, of having the stand-up, really privileges that idea that I'm going to make a mistake and that's going to be okay because I'm going to get it in the next design iteration. And when you're trying to solve a physical or tangible digital problem, that might make more sense than when you're looking at an ethical or regulatory framework. And so having, a checklist that you're going to follow, I think it misses some of that nuance, and similar to what Peter was saying in his remarks, right? And so I think when you want to think about value-centered design, is there a way that the time horizon needs to be extended, or there needs to be, a centering of stakeholders as opposed to methodology in order to be responsive to that? So that was my thought, but I appreciate the thinking.
So the points about speed and kind of what Agile is trying to get at reminded me that the complement of Agile development is like waterfall development, right? You plan everything out, and then you kind of go through each stage in a very set way. And so if we really are concerned about safety, and we're upset that Tesla is beta testing its driverless cars on all of us, like why don't we just say, well, maybe this should be waterfall? And I know waterfall is not sexy, right? But like, why not just say that?
Yeah, I think all of any development methodology sort of winds up with like unexpected problems, and that's just sort of like natural about building something. Even if you think you planned everything out, like he was indicating, there's going to be something unexpected, and so planning to expect that and have a process in place to like onboard that event and deal with it and take steps to address it, I think is just one of the important parts. And even when knowing that there are unexpected things, there's a lot of things that are like very predictable that are not being addressed in a lot of projects. And this is sort of to try and equip teams to be capable of addressing the very straightforward, predictable stuff, just based on the variety of people that exist that have different experiences. we can learn about that now and at least do the first step so that we're not really, really messing up at the start. But we at least get to step 2 before there's a disaster.
Thank you.
Hello, Kristen Thomasen from UBC, this time representing myself. Thank you for the paper and for the comments, Lionel. It was such an interesting conversation. Like many of the other people who have come up, like I really appreciate the way that you're approaching trying to create solutions or an approach, like something that we can do on the ground to deal with what is an incredibly important issue. So I really appreciate you taking that on and tackling that in your paper. And to your last point, we were just having a conversation last night about Amazon Ring, and no offense to anyone, if Amazon had asked one person who'd experienced domestic violence, they would have had a list of examples of things that should be considered with the development of Amazon Ring. Like, to your point about there are a lot of harms that are foreseeable that we're just not mitigating at all, that are equity issues, that really do involve participant, lived experience, or standpoint knowledge if we want to talk kind of concepts. The fact that these just aren't even being captured in a lot of, to the point of scale, technologies that are going to be distributed widely, I think is really important. So I really appreciate what you're doing. My question is not really specific to the paper, it's a little bit more meta. It's something that I'm grappling with actually from reading a bunch of the amazing papers that are here right now, which is how do we do the interdisciplinary thinking, which I know is like, we're at an interdisciplinary conference, please nobody cancel me for this question. But I just and for good reasons, engineers, computer scientists think about some of these concepts so differently than how lawyers and social scientists and STS scholars and philosophers think about issues. And I'm even thinking about Ryan's STS paper right now and like the normativity and the pragmatism of law. And I don't know, just like something's tickling my brain in the papers that we have, and yours is one of them, where it's just, we have these incredibly value-laden, complex legal concepts that maybe reflect social norms and maybe not perfectly, that the courts cannot figure out. Like, I'm thinking about equality law in Canada, and it is amazing and a disaster at the exact same time. However, like lawyers can't even explain what it is. How do we translate that for engineers, for the people who actually are going to operationalize it? Like law's pragmatism, how do we put that into design? And I'm really struggling with like, is it possible? It's a meta question, you don't have to answer that. Yeah, anyway, don't cancel me.
No, I think that's I think that's an excellent point, and like one of the things that I'd really like to look into but haven't had a chance is a lot of like human robot teaming papers like that are say manufacturing widgets. A lot of them measure the performance of people and give them scores, and that can often be used for firing people. But I'm not aware of any that are looking at, well, what if the person on the team is disabled in some way? Some people have to, go to the bathroom more frequently because of a medical condition, and that would impact their score. They could be fired based on that. So the algorithms are just not designing to be legal. Like the algorithms could optimize people away and be firing them, and that in a discriminatory way. And I expect that's very likely. I don't know how to go and investigate that yet, but like we need to be thinking about what the law is when we design algorithms.
Hi, my name is Christine Chang. I am finishing up my PhD in computer science at U Boulder, and I study human-robot interaction. I think this paper goes in a great direction. I appreciate you bringing these issues to our attention. So I've been thinking about how to address the issue that was brought up earlier about, this is such an expansive field, right? Your related works tries to talk about so many things, and it's so hard to tie all of that together. And that kind of prompted me to come up with another question that perhaps expands it even more. But I didn't see in here how you want to incorporate those minoritized voices. Like you talk about participatory design, but I don't see, it's very much about process and not necessarily the people who are participating in that process. And I think that that's a key component that I think you could add and would add a lot of value. I know, Scrum itself doesn't necessarily talk about who should be at the table, but I think that that could be something really interesting to add to this. So I guess my question is really, like, was that something that you thought about? And at the beginning it seems like you had, because you bring up the nothing about us without us and talk about participatory design and those kinds of things. So I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, some of the thoughts I have is like, depending on the size of their organization, like different costs and the, requirements, like IRB requirements if you're at the university, or it can change. But like one of the things is like through the pages of books is like at least a starting point that a very small team could do is like read about the experiences of different people, and especially relating to the type of project that you're working on. That's at least a basic starting point. Then often there's people interacting on social media about the topics related to your project, and at a very, very basic initial like figure out who you should be talking to. That's like one step, and then there's like more working with someone who's familiar with like community engaged research and connected to a community, talking to organizations that represent different communities is another way. But those in turn have their own problem. That'll only hit people connected to those organizations, and so that can also miss people. So it's a very complicated and expansive problem that maybe there's books on. I've had a bit of trouble actually finding stuff about the actual step-by-step. How do I onboard in a team or organization or people who don't know to doing these things? And yeah, that's that's a very excellent question. And those are some of the ideas I have at this time. I would love more also.
Thank you. So I'm Margo Kaminsky, also at University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm going to attempt some of the interdisciplinary approach or question one. So at PLSC, the Privacy Law Scholars Conference this year, I presented a super early draft of a piece I'm doing with Gian Claudio Malgieri, who's my European co-author currently at Lionel, on the way the law is trying to address stakeholder participation in algorithmic development. So we're on the law side of this. I want to be in conversation with you. First, this question is by way of introduction. But to give you some backdrop, and thinking about a question that came up earlier, the law is not going to give you your answers. In fact, like the few places where we're seeing attention in algorithmic governance laws to stakeholder participation, the language is really broad, super vague, and so deferential to tech companies to try to figure out how to do it. So that's point number one. There's not going to be a law, I don't think, that's going to tell you or structure how to do this, unless people like you and me have conversations and try to figure out like what's missing from an organization perspective. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how that law might go. In EU's General Data Protection Regulation, one of the only mentions of stakeholder participation is in the setup for algorithmic or data protection impact assessments, where the law doesn't require, but suggests that companies that perform high-risk processing, which includes automated decision-making or using artificial intelligence on personal information, probably should go talk to impacted stakeholder groups. But then in the guidelines to the law, the big regulator explains, by that we mean do some Qualtrics surveys. So very, very different from what you're conceiving here. The US proposed law never became a law. The Algorithmic Accountability Act is a little bit more complex on how it thinks about stakeholder participation. So it'll say stuff like, you're doing an internal impact assessment, make sure you're talking to representative groups. And then just a third possible model is that, again, a proposed law, not an enacted law. In Washington State, there was a law proposed where they talked about basically making this into the public rulemaking equivalent. So saying the agency that's going to be enforcing non-discrimination stuff for automated decision-making, at that level, when they're making the rules, they must go talk to impacted marginalized communities. So those are kind of, roughly speaking, the kinds of moves we've made in the law. None of them are helpful for you. Where it might be helpful is, well, two places. One is kind of theoretical and the other is concrete. Law does a lot with record keeping and can do a lot with record keeping. So when you talk about making equity logs, or you talk about other kinds of like document production and retention, that's the kind of place where a law can require, and in some cases has tried to require companies to like hold on to documents as evidence so that a regulator can later step in and use that against the company. And then the second place is there is a lot of discussion, to Christine's point, about what does it mean to have representative groups, and what does it mean to substantively empower them. So that literature does exist. I'm happy to kind of point you in that direction. The unfortunate thing is I don't think there's like a clear solution in any way. But when you're thinking about points for intervention by the law, that's what you're likely to get. It's going to be record keeping and maybe some theory on like what does it mean to have participation by a group and where have we seen this elsewhere in the law, but it's not going to give you like a command and control, this is what you should be doing in participation.
You want to respond?
I mean, that's really great information, and yeah, I definitely would like to talk about it some more. Let's see. Yeah, the Qualtrics surveys, that sounds like it's not quite up to what we need. And yeah, I think that really, I guess it's definitely going to be a big problem. And yeah, that's actually one of the limitations in the paper, is that even if it were like much more effective than what existing organizations do, but still imperfect, like this organization, they can just not do it. Like one of the things I mentioned several times is the CEO can just be like, oh no, we're not doing this. It's over. It's done. Whenever an issue comes up, Microsoft just fired a whole bunch of their ethics teams. I think Twitter did that too, and there's not much. They can just do that. So it's definitely a major limitation. And yeah, some might want to not do this because then it lets them evade liability, like doing the records and things like that.
Thank you. Hi, Nicholson Price, Michigan Law School. Interesting project, fun paper. I guess my question actually follows on what you just said, which is you mentioned in the limitations section that one of the assumptions is that this gets equity buy-in. And so what I'm wondering is, I guess a three-part question. How essential is that assumption? How can we make that assumption less essential? And how realistic is that assumption? Because I agree with you that at least my intuitive answer as to the second question is that it's absolutely foundational, and that if the developers don't want to make this more equitable, then all of these steps around procedure can easily fall into the checkbox culture. So I think of our Waldman's book about privacy and just saying, here is a process that we go through and we say, yes, we thought about privacy. It turns out we don't think privacy matters. Cool, let's move on to the next step. And then just repeat that every week, and it's nice, but it doesn't really get you that far. And so I'm wondering, is your intuition different? That, and it might be. I'm not in the engineering space. I'm deeply pessimistic because I'm in the law space. And I'm wondering if you think actually people are deeply striving to make these products equitable and safe for all groups, and we should be doing this right. And the question is, what's the toolbox to do that effectively? Or is this a problem where whatever value that has is relatively downweighted to concerns of efficiency, profitability, whatever the other things are? And so your comments at the end of your last response, I think, get towards an intuition that maybe it's the latter. So if that's the case, I guess my question is, how do we put more stick behind the procedure? There's an easy move to say like, let's have conversations about, let's do procedure, let's ask stakeholders what they want, but if there's not a, and then we do what they want. I don't think it's easy for law to step in there, but is that what you want? Is the answer like, do we need law to step in and say, give stakeholders a vote? Like how do we is this just procedure? And if it's just procedure, does that require buy-in? And if it does require buy-in, do you think it's there?
See, there's so many layers to the question, I don't know if I'll be able to get all of them in one go, but I think that there organizations exist that are like willing to make adjustments, I think, and changes to do better, but don't know how to like start or onboard, and the disconnect of all the different bodies of literature. There's just they don't even know how to start. So that's like it's sort of trying to lower that hump to sort of get more organizations doing better than before. There's definitely others that will just not and will not be interested. There's teams that will not be interested. Often, sometimes hearing from individual experiences of people will change some people's minds, where someone was just like, if you, one example is I've heard from people who, are bilingual, and when bilingual people are talking, they write in both languages, say Spanish and English, it'll be like a mix of both, and they'll be fighting with the autocorrect. And so, someone hearing that, some people will think about addressing that. And that's sort of addressable at an earlier stage, like when autocorrect's being created. And let's see, what were some of the other parts of the question? Sorry.
Well, actually, like, what do you? So in response, I was going to say, what's the use of the law if it's not to make people do things they don't want to do? Right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's what I thought we were here. I mean.
Yeah, that's one of the, probably would require changes to law, but getting people thinking about it and like making it feasible and having organizations that are doing it successfully could at least sort of start that ball rolling, maybe snowball effect, hope, but obviously that can also just be shut down in many cases, and there will be many people, but it's a hope, a long-term hope. I don't think it'll be totally solved, but at least do better.
I guess I was also just wondering, like, your intuition, because my intuition is that of the bucket of, like, people that want to do it right versus and don't know how, versus people that are like, meh, sure, whatever, like, or don't care at all. I have a very vague intuition that there are lots of actors in this bucket and some actors in this bucket, but maybe I'm hoping for optimism from somebody that's in the engineering space, not the law space, to tell me this bucket is overflowing. So this intervention will help, and this bucket is small, and we just hear about them more.
I think that people who are indifferent is the larger bucket, unfortunately. I agree with you on that point.
My question is related to sort of like the frequency of procedures when it comes to ethical AI, whether it's impact assessments or like equitable design or design justice workshops. Because something we're exploring, right, is how can we do things more frequently and make it more lightweight in corporate settings so it's more practical for teams? Because we try different approaches where you do like the big consequence scanning workshop at the beginning of the project, where you bring in loads of people, it's quite time intensive. Or we try lighter weight ones, we do consequence scanning each week, which is more frequent, so teams don't forget about it. But it's just how can you, what's the best approach in terms of like frequency of doing these sorts of things?
That's a really hard question and good one. It might depend on like the project and the cadence of the project. Like building, an app that controls an existing robot, right? It might make sense to do a higher cadence then because the timeline is shorter. If you're making physical hardware, then it can be really important to get, some key stuff in early on. So it might be more valuable to do the heavier weight thing where, where change is a much higher cost. So I think it would be context dependent on the project scope.
To your point, right, it's a checkbox approach. And I think this is a mistake we fundamentally made with the data privacy regulation. We sort of follow, do the impact assessment and go through these boxes. But again, when it comes to things like ethical AI, which are very qualitative and fail in a number of different ways, you have to think more creatively and have foresight, that sort of thing. So it can be very difficult to narrow it down to like fill out this impact assessment, follow these guidelines all the time to make sure it's being implemented properly. So I was thinking, would it be, like in all honesty, would it be more beneficial if everyone was taught how to do consequence scanning and ethical design over having more tick boxes?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest things to even make this concept effective, it has to be someone who's genuinely engaged. People who are just, or you know, that's where some of the feedback mechanisms can come in where, you know, but that would, so if someone gives negative feedback, that means there is a record that someone had said, hey, this is going to be a problem, and then it was ignored. So it can produce mechanisms that would, in the long run, lead to changes. But you know, the whole thing, if it's people who are just going through the motions, it's really not going to do a lot. There has to be at least one person on a team who has influence and is engaged. I feel like is my speculation at least. But great question, thanks.
Hi, I'm Daniela. I'm a PhD student at the MIT Media Lab. I think one thing we're all missing around here is the fact that the design teams and engineering teams are operating on behalf of a company. And regardless if somebody has ethical training, they still have to do at the end of the day what the company wants and kind of what's going to reach the ultimate goal of the company. So I think I'm struggling here with how much we teach the individual teams and people versus how much we think about more structural changes.
Hi, Sean here again. Two things that talking about what does this mean from a legal perspective. Right away my mind goes to SOX compliance. It's something where Enron happened, and then SOX compliance came around, and companies are required to do this. So we will probably see, looking ahead, I would speculate that we would see some inequity happen, and that this would be thrust upon companies to do as part of compliance. The second thing is the personal scorecards. I read through that and saw more of an equity maturity model. I don't know if that would be more helpful to frame it in that model. To say there's software maturity models. I think this would be a good way for industry to adopt.
Reframe is a great idea.
Okay, I'm going back with a follow-up based on some of the discussion about velocity and speed and your answer when it came to the cadence of the scorecards, which seemed to match up a lot better with an increment within a sprint. And it occurred to me that the somewhat less used these days Six Sigma way of taking the temperature of things might work as a cadence for those scorecards on a sprint level. Although, I don't know, speeding up ethics questions is really a good idea. And to the point of you make it a law so people will follow the process, as someone who has been through the DOEA process on the government side, if people disagree with the engineering process, they'll find ways to work around it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stacey Dogan. I'm from BU. I have an announcement. I went upstairs to get some ibuprofen. If anyone who was at the party last night needs some, I have some over here.
If people prefer that.
Yeah, we've got aspirin here as well. But I have a serious, it's a not clearly articulated impulse that follows from the point about compliance. These private sector firms are not going to do this because they're just good guys and feel like acting ethically. They're going to incorporate, not that they're not good people, but the incentives in our capitalist economy are not in favor of imposing or taking on extra costs unless you have to, right? And these procedures are costly, and so there's this interrelationship between legal rules and sort of consequences of behavior that causes these harms to certain populations. And the responses by companies to try to avoid liability, right? And so one of the big challenges, this goes back to ex ante versus ex post rules. We can sort of tell companies to do these procedures all we want, but unless there is some financial consequence in the form of damages when they adopt systems that are discriminatory, then it's going to be a box checking exercise. So there has to be, and I mean this is just a call for the interdisciplinary thinkers in the room to sort of think about ways to recommend rules. So rules about the system's outcomes, but also auditing systems, auditing approaches, and accountability throughout the life cycle of a system. And we've had conversations about the iterative relationship between the legal rules and the technology. We need to keep coming back at these systems and ensure that the law assesses these systems critically and assesses their impact and has real consequences when they fail to live up to our expectations. We're not there, obviously, but I do feel like we're in a moment of conversation about these issues and these values that we should take advantage of.
Thank you, and with that, I think we're out of time, so let's give Andrew a round of applause.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the afternoon sessions of We Robots. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. I appreciate that excitement. Before we get into our dual session on safety, which is a thing that we often do at We Robot, where we'll take papers that have similar themes and discuss them collectively. Just a few quick announcements. Those who are participating in the poster session, and I'll say this again at the end, but I want to get everybody before and after. After this session at 3 p.m., please go out into the atrium. We will have your poster boards, we will have your easels, we will help you get everything set up during the next session so that our final session of the day, which is our poster session, everyone will be all ready and set up. But then be sure to come back so that you can do your 1-minute lightning pitch of your poster rounds before we open up to the session. And then I'll also have a little bit more to say about how to find dinner and drinks this evening, which is basically just the building that looks like a bunch of Jenga blocks stacked on top of each other. You've no doubt seen it. We're at the very top of that one. So, but now let's get on with the show. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm Kristen Thomasen from the University of British Columbia. Very happy to be the discussant. I'll pass around this mic so everyone can introduce themselves and then we'll get underway.
Sure. I'm Kegan Strawn. I'm at the University of Southern California. I'm getting my PhD in computer science and robotics. We have a little one
good.
too.
I'm Caitlin Heppner. I'm at the University of Ottawa doing a PhD in philosophy.
I'm Jason Millar. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa. This one?
Perfect. That's baby Luca. There's a baby in the room. I can't help but draw it. Sorry. And he's waving, so it's perfect. Okay. So yeah, I'm super excited. We get to re-elevate your blood sugar levels this afternoon with a panel about safety, and it is not about existential threat. It is actually about our daily experiences of safety, which, as you can maybe tell, I love and I'm very excited about. So we have two super interesting papers on this panel. They're talking about different things, but I think are both offering recommendations for practical ways of improving safety in relation to robotics and artificial intelligence systems. To some degree, I think these papers are in conversation with each other, even though obviously they were written separately of one another, which is also very exciting, and I'll try and touch on some of those overlaps or conversations that they're having. And I think to some degree, some of the proposals in our more technical paper can maybe even come into addressing some of the considerations raised in our ethical paper, which is really cool. And I think both also reflect in some ways some of the strengths and challenges of interdisciplinary thinking, and how do we take these like value-laden concepts when we're in the legal space and translate them into engineering or computer science, or how do we take something from an ethics context and translate it into actual practice and what we see literally in the streets, as you would have seen from some of the examples provided in Jason and Caitlin's paper. And this is an interdisciplinary conference when we have math in one of our papers.
Sorry.
I thought it was excellent. I had to read it 3 or 4 times, but it was a lot of fun to engage with like actual technical proposals that then interrelate back to a legal concept, which is cool. Okay, so I will do my best to describe each of the papers briefly, just to rejuvenate your memories on what each of them is about, and then I'll share some comments, and then I'm going to turn it over because I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. So on our more technical paper, we have what I see as sort of a central proposal for a safety filter for a collision avoidance application on our automated vehicles. And I take it from the paper, I think in the sort of thrust of the paper, you're really talking about like automated vehicles replacing cars, but there is some reference also to sidewalk robots, drones. We can imagine that this could apply in a range of different contexts that engage different kinds of safety issues. But what we're really talking about in this paper, what the authors are really talking about in this paper, is a means of avoiding collisions, but adding a filter onto the machine learning system that performs that function, that also allows for adaptable tweaking, if I'm correct in understanding that, allows for greater explainability, so creates a record that is easier to understand, so that when we want to go back and get an explanation for why something wrong happened, it's more feasible. Basically, the way I read it is we're taking a technical layer and adding it onto something that's much more complex underneath of the system that allows for maybe a better way to address some of the legal concerns that come up when we're talking about safety and how do we improve safety. My perspective is this is really mostly focused on risk mitigation, which is a component of safety, of a bigger vision of safety, but it's obviously a really important component because, if there are a lot of collisions happening, we are not going to feel safe on our roads, sidewalks, or skies. And something else that was really interesting in the paper, I thought, and this is what speaks, I think, to Jason and Caitlin's paper as well, was the idea of using simulation testing to test the filter, I believe.
Yeah,
or the whole system.
The whole system.
So running the system through a simulation, instead of sending it out into the public road and testing it on pedestrians who have no way of knowing that they're involved in beta testing and that they're contributing to this big corporate program, instead we run these systems through a simulation that is meant to reflect aspects of reality, and then we can make sure that it's sufficient before it's out in actual practice, out in the world. And then, in addition, in the paper, there's a consideration of how this idea of a filter, sort of a technical solution to some of the legal problems, can align with the legal landscape or regulatory requirements. Or, I think in particular, the authors are really focusing on the U.S. blueprint for Bill of Rights, for AI Bill of Rights, sorry. This is the Canadian and me stumbling over the term. So maybe not even so much a regulatory system, but like a blueprint or like proposal system. So thinking ahead to what some of the laws might look like. So we have an integration of law and the technical side of safety in an effort to develop this proposal for something that could offer greater possibilities, I think. And then we have a paper on ethics and how medical ethics can lend some insights for thinking about how we approach safety more broadly, I think. So Jason and Caitlin discuss a category of robotics and AI that they call safety critical, which are the technologies that create an unreasonable risk to well-being. So not systems that promote safety, which I think is our first paper, but really systems that almost inherently endanger safety. Perhaps somewhat like what Ryan and Daniela were talking about in the last panel. They give a range of different examples of the kind of technology that they're thinking about. Tesla's cars constantly being in beta testing is one example. So like all of us are just test subjects and Tesla's beta testing. The other example they give is Uber's fatal pedestrian collision. And then there's a range of examples. So we've got like real world physical examples, and we also have examples of recommender algorithms that are known to be bad for people's mental health and well-being and are deployed nevertheless. So they draw an analogy between RAI, as they call it, or robotics and AI, safety thinking, and medical ethics, which has this long and I would say very tumultuous history that you do know, but I think you could integrate better into the paper, and draw out some values from medical ethics that are now, today, generally speaking, more commonly accepted in medical ethics, but that could be useful for our thinking and regulating for safety elsewhere. And that is informed consent, so like requiring that the people involved in the testing actually have an opportunity to A, opt out if they want to, and B, provide consent. The application of the standard of care, not talking about torts, although I do think we could consider torts and its overlap here as well, but more so talking about when a medical test is done, the patients who are involved in the test aren't left with like a less valid than is already accepted medical treatment. Like they wouldn't get a worse treatment than what is typically available to other patients. They have to get the minimum standard plus more. And adverse event reporting, which to Margot's point earlier is something the law is really good at, which is requiring record keeping and reporting and that sort of thing. So that's basically what they're getting at with that. I was in error, and I'll tell you my error in case you made the same error, in thinking that they were really calling for specific regulations. But after some conversations with the authors, that is not the case. They're not calling for regulations, but proposing values that can inform things like regulation, whether that be regulation through law or through other mechanisms like self-regulation or other kinds of approaches to adjusting corporate behavior. So 3 broad principles that we can think about in the relationship to safety. Okay, sorry, I think I talked longer than I wanted to in the descriptive, but now I'm going to give you my thoughts and then I'm going to shut up. So my reflections, the first one is a statement of the obvious, but safety is really hard. Defining the concept of safety is really hard. And I know because I wrote a paper last year where I really struggled to define the concept of safety. And more and more I'm thinking it's not unlike privacy in its very protean nature and the ways that it can be wielded strategically by lawmakers and others to accomplish certain goals. So I kind of feel like the safety discourse in AI is becoming the new privacy discourse, to compliment Woody for giving me the wording on that. But there is something of a safety is the new privacy in my mind. I could be wrong. Feel free to push back on that. Another statement of the obvious, though, and I think this really came out in thinking through the papers or reading through the papers, is that engineers, computer scientists, folks in the technical disciplines really see safety as something very different than what lawmakers see safety as. And the law definition of safety is incredibly complex and fraught, and I think the technical understandings of safety are maybe more straightforward in the sense of like, let's avoid collisions or let's mitigate certain kinds of risks, but that a lot of work can be done in translating from one to the other that I think would be really cool, and I think is something that your paper is especially primed to do. But if we lose that nuance, we risk using technical understandings of safety to push for lawmakers to regulate in ways that actually maybe doesn't develop more safety. Sorry, Luke. Look, a baby! I can't help it. My maternal instinct is immediately to respond.
He agrees. He thinks it's a great point, Auntie Kristen.
Thanks, Luca.
Thank you so much for bringing it up.
So all of this is just to say that I do think that there's a lot more translation work that can be done. And just as an example of what I meant in that last point, that like if we lose this nuance, we risk making bad laws that actually danger our safety. One of the examples that you all provide in your paper of regulation is drug regulation. So like we regulate certain drugs because they're considered unsafe. But to me, that really jumped out as an example of that's a space where, yes, sure, we've regulated against drugs because they're unsafe. but in doing so have created an entire carceral structure that has like really reshaped Canadian and US society. The prison industrial complex is largely promoted by the war on drugs. And that is a law or a long and extensive set of laws that were developed to promote safety. So it's just as an example that we risk losing a lot when we don't translate properly. Okay, so to our technical piece, our safety filter piece. So my first thought is I really want a salad dressing and not a sandwich. So I think right now the piece reads a little bit like a law section, an engineer, or a technical section, a computer science section, and then a law section at the end. And what I would really, so kind of like a sandwich, what I would really love is for you to mix those up and make that like mixed compound of a salad dressing where we actually integrate the law into the technical discussion, because it is so interesting. I think it's something that like if one of your intended audience members is regulators, I think it's something that if you really handhold people through like the explanations, like, I read it multiple times. I don't know that a regulator would sit down and read a paper multiple times. But if you really walk people through and do the translation in that middle section, I think that would be really, really fascinating. There's already a lot of fascinating stuff in there. This is more of a structure. And I think the same is true with the ethical side. Like if you wanted it to be translated into regulations, which might not be your intention with this paper, but maybe in the future, is a little bit more of a hand-holding of how does this integrate into the legal structure, that pragmatism that Ryan's STS paper I always love coming back to. Let me just refresh my memory of my notes. Oh yeah, okay, so, and an example of that, so I really want to see that translation between law and technical thinkings around safety, and an example of that I think comes out in the paper is you talk about the Bill of Rights for AI and some of the principles of the Bill of Rights, and then explain how the safety filter met them, including things like inclusion, which we had a panel on earlier, non-discrimination. But I didn't see actually like the value-laden concepts of the law discussed there, but more so just that some aspects of inclusion of different kinds of engineering techniques or different kinds of thinking about design of safety came into the consideration. So I think that could really be expanded and it would make for a really interesting discussion. And this leads to a meta point, which I brought up in a question earlier, but really is just like, how do we even do this kind of translation? So it could be something really interesting because of the partnership that you have for your paper to do some of that thinking of how do we actually translate this technical idea into the mind space of a lawmaker and what lawmakers think about. You mentioned inclusion a few times in the paper, but I don't see it fleshed out in a way that is substantive, and I think it would be interesting to see that discussed more, or just take out the references so that it's not a toss-away reference to inclusion and non-discrimination. But that also leads into some thinking around, part of your simulation idea is really predicated on having these large data sets that you can run your program through to test if it's actually safe before you release it into the public space. But how do you get those data sets? Privacy is a very important component of safety, as Michael has so wonderfully stated previously. And so if we need a large amount of public data or data from public spaces, how is that intersecting with the idea of safety that also encapsulates privacy? Is that going to be an impediment to doing this kind of simulation testing if we can't develop something that's reflective enough of the real world without violating privacy at the same time? And I think inclusion could come in there too if you wanted to integrate it into the thinking around what kind of world are we creating in which we're testing these systems so that they go out into the world prepared for what we want to see. And then Jason and Caitlin's paper, which is also super interesting and has so much to offer for us. I would love to see more definition of what unreasonable harm is. I can't help it, I'm a lawyer, like we use the term reasonable all the time, and it's not exactly a concisely defined concept. So I think a little bit more thinking around like the structure of what constitutes the kind of harm that makes a system safety critical would be really interesting and helpful. And in part I think about that because I wonder how much the medical ethics analogy doesn't address the ways that risks and threats to safety can be invisibilized. And so what I mean by that, so you open your paper with this really compelling, bringing us back to the beginnings of the pandemic narrative. And the first thing I thought was we all watched in real time as it became very wide. It might have been known, I think, to some already, but very widely known to the public that the pulse oximeter, the little thing that we put on our hand to test our blood oxygen levels, was not designed for everybody. And that is a medical device. I don't know what kind of medical ethics testing it goes through exactly. That's not my area of expertise. But just the contrast of thinking about vaccines and medical ethics, creating these safe vaccines, and at the very same time, folks with darker complexions were suffering from the inaccuracies of pulse oximeters. And we watched that sort of unveil itself in the discourse around COVID. And so is there a risk that medical ethics is actually limited in ways that if we translate that over to AI and robotics, we risk invisibilizing problems further? I.e., are we over-romanticizing medical ethics a little bit? I mentioned, you cite some regulatory examples, but I think you could even almost take those out and make yourself some more space to talk about the analogy between why is medical ethics pertinent and helpful to thinking about robotics and artificial intelligence. And in part, that is also because a lot of medical ethics today involves robotics and artificial intelligence. So how does that play into the analogy, or is it useful to your analogy maybe? And then the last thing I would say on that is the informed consent proposal is super interesting. Informed consent in a medical context, like you're in this really contained or controlled environment to obtain informed consent. But when I think about that translating into practice, like I would be terrified of a world in which I have to give informed consent to every Tesla that drives by me, which I know is not what you're recommending. But I think that could be sort of the end result of an application of that principle. I think if what you're saying is Tesla should not be testing in public spaces on unwitting pedestrians, and not just Tesla, I'm picking on them because, whatever. But all of these vehicle companies should not be testing in public spaces without us having opportunities to opt in or opt out or get something for it, because that's another part of the analogy that I didn't necessarily see, is like when we wait for vaccines to come out, we get something out of that. We get that protection from the vaccine, but like Tesla gets the profit from its car company getting better and more precise. So what do we as pedestrians get back from that? Yeah, sorry, I think I lost my string of thought there, but there's just some further fleshing out that I think would be awesome in that analogy that you're drawing. Because I'm not saying it's the wrong analogy, but I think it's an interesting one to consider why you chose that analogy. Yes. Okay, there's a point there, I'll come back to it. But for both of you, I do think, this is my second to last point, I do think that safety also has a temporal structure in relation to harm. And by that I mean, I think that there's safety considerations that arise before harm occurs, there's safety considerations that arise as harm occurs, and there's safety considerations that arise after harm occurs. And I think there's space for both of your ideas to engage more of the during and after than is currently in there. It's not to say that it's not at all in there, but I think that there could be more explicit thinking around like, what does this mean after? And that's another space where I think you're in conversation with each other, like the idea of reporting requirements feeding back into a safety filter that maybe in some ways replaces the need for public testing and giving informed consent every time a car drives by, creates some really interesting possibilities for new ways of thinking about how we would regulate safety. And I remember the thing I was going to say about informed consent. If what you really want to say is Tesla should not test in public spaces, I think it would be great for you to just say that. Like, you just shouldn't be allowed to test out in public space where you can't get informed consent, where you're not in a controlled environment. I think that would be a very provocative proposal. And maybe aligns with medical ethics? I think so, from what you said in the paper. Okay, so my very, very final thought is just that safety is effing complex and is also very interdisciplinary. And I think the, brain tickle that I'm getting about how do we translate what are very different concepts and very different disciplines, but super crucial to actually how we live and experience robotics and AI in our lives, is such an interesting difficult issue, and I think it really coalesces around this concept of safety. Not necessarily, I want to be so bold as to say more than in any other area, but more than in anything I've been thinking about recently. So thank you both so much for such interesting, provocative, thought-provoking papers. I'll turn it over and give you each an opportunity if you want to respond, and then we can take questions. And I think you can all start lining up whenever you want to.
Sure. Wow. That was great. Thank you for doing that. You really covered it well. And I totally agree. It's super complex. And I think coming from an engineering perspective, you know, when we talk about safety, we just tend to go, oh yeah, thing one didn't collide with thing two, it's safe. Like, that's as deep as that conversation goes. It goes a little further in places, but that's kind of the idea. And so with this paper, it was a lot of work. I got really excited about how far and how big this paper was going to be, and there was going to be like real experiments, and that's going to tie back into the legal thinking, and then I realized it's hard to actually do that, and that's why it's so great we have this wee robot to bring us all together and to think about this from all the different perspectives, and yeah, so it's really hard. And I loved your paper as well. I think there's a lot of tie-ins between the two, and the informed consent and the reporting as well, like the safety filter, it's part of that reporting and everything. So I think there's a lot of really interesting conversations to be had. And not only with the safety filter in my paper, but also with the simulations and the data. That when we think about like, there's the company Waymo producing autonomous vehicles as part of Google. They're putting they're out currently in Texas and in San Francisco and Arizona and LA now too. They're collecting data out in the real world and using simulations and using all that data together in kind of a loop that just sort of keeps on going. And there's a lot of privacy and security questions there. And yeah, it's just really interesting space. And yeah, you summed it up well.
Thank you. That was a wonderful engagement with our paper. And again, my name is Caitlin from the University of Ottawa. Thank you for your really insightful thoughts. And two things I picked up on as you were talking that I think would be really worth exploring as we build the paper is really getting into the problematization of informed consent and the history of that struggle of trying to figure out what does it mean to give informed consent, specifically in the medical context, but then seeing how that can apply to technologies that aren't necessarily part of the medical context. And the second point I really liked was about the carceral effects of regulation. And I didn't really think of it in that context while we were writing the paper about the regulation of harmful substances and the effects that has had. So that was really useful. I want to talk about our sensibility starting, if that's okay, really quickly. We basically started with this intuition that we have a strong ethical principle framework for regulating the testing of drugs and biomedical technologies on people, specifically because of some harms on the one hand, that we're finding similarities in technologies that don't have that same ethical principles to regulate the testing, particularly when the testing is necessarily done in public. So automated vehicles need to be tested on roadways and not just in closed environments. So can we draw those lines there? Is there a meaningful difference between a harm from a drug you take and a harm from, say, consuming media on social media? Are those harms meaningfully different? And if they're not, maybe we can use those same principles across disciplines. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kristen. Yeah, I'm going to say something very briefly. It is wild that we have this strong intuition about what we should be doing with certain technologies and that we have seemingly no intuition about these. I find it just wild that we have, that we just, that was really the core insight that started driving this. But I do want to say something about the experience of writing the paper and where I've come to, and I think Caitlin and I both have come to, and it really reflects what you're saying, Kristen, is that safety as a concept, the more we dig into it as a research group, the more we talk to different groups of engineers who are designing different kinds of technologies and ask them how they think about safety, there's very little consensus. Like there's no consensus. The concepts are understood wildly differently by regulators, by the public, by ethicists, by engineers. And among engineers, you'll get as much different kind of opinion on what it means to design for safety as anywhere else. It's just like there's the concept needs work. I think there's a lifetime of work that we could do interdisciplinarily, thinking about that concept, like the way that privacy has evolved over the last, say, 20, 25 years, as Michael and so many of you in the room know. That's where I'll leave it for now. I'm looking forward to the questions, and I just want to turn it over to make sure we leave as much space for it. So thank you so much for the commentary there.
Hi, Michael from Kegan University of School of Law. I'm really happy to be here. I like both papers, but my comments are only on the Strawn and Scholz paper, because I think I have more to offer you. I really like this paper, by the way, except for the tiny typeface. And to the extent that the audience is builders and deployers, and you're giving them some smart ideas about what to do, I totally get it, but that would be enough for me. To the extent the audience is regulators and legislators, I'm not sure I get it as much, or at least I think it needs more clarity. I mean, I get why, as other people suggest, this is not the project, that we want mandatory data quality rules, or meta tagging, there's disclosure, audits, right? Impact audits and assessments, because we want to make the organization put issues on this agenda, make people own the problem. We want to make visible be visible, discourage opaque discrimination, make less of it. But for car safety or other kinds of safety, restaurants, that's pretty visible. Right? So if I'm a regulator, and you tell me I should practice diving deeply into different architectures and algorithms, that's a heavy lift. And why do I need to do it? I just have to count the number of feet that get broken. Is what I'm thinking. So, and also, the trend in American administrative law, at least since the 70s, is away from command and control regulation. You don't want to say, use this algorithm. You want to talk about performance standard. So you're pushing against that, at least in parts of the paper. In other parts of the paper, we talk about standards. So I guess my one request to you is be more consistent. Recite your on and explain why. The other thing is, this is a minor point, but just to sort of alluded to it. You talk about, very sensibly about how, we ought to do some simulation testing. But you explain to me why the data we use for the sim testing is going to be any better than the data which may have produced the original model that we test, we'll test the model, train the model on. If it's better, why didn't we use that in the first place? So, why the simulation is going to help us? I need to know more. I'm not saying I can't, I'm just saying I didn't get it. So if I'm a regulator, I think I can write a rule, don't kill children. And I don't have to go into all this stuff. And you're telling me places I do, I just didn't quite get how or why. But I think it's a great paper.
Appreciate that, thank you. I think that's a really good point, and I'll definitely take that in and think about that when we work more on this. The idea when we were writing it is to do more as well, so we didn't ultimately get to finish what we wanted. And a lot of that was tying it back into an example where we would actually have it on a real robot and then tie it back in. And I think it seems like the law answer often when I ask questions is it depends, and I feel like here it depends as well. Like safety with a car kind of seems simple at first, but I think when you dig into it, it gets a lot more complex and emergent things that you weren't expecting. And when you start talking about like autonomous vehicles going down the road and the data that it collected once for training could have shifted once it's now in testing. And so I think just even that it didn't see the same data that it saw in training alone provides something that it hadn't, it wouldn't have otherwise. So just even having two separate things of data provides you with a more well-rounded model.
It's not simulation anymore.
Yeah, so it even could still be simulation too. Like it depends. And so I think my point with this paper is I really just want to say it depends in this as well. When you get talking about actual models like AI, if you're using one neural network is very different from another. One thing with so much data and simulation is if we could go and put like a benchmark out there that everybody had to hit or something like that, then that could also help, so that you have like a base sort of like standard of care or something like that. So, thank you.
It's a nice note to end on, because my question is sort of like over the safety standard of care, right? So under the AI Act, it's clear we're going to have to do conformity assessments for things like safety component of product or safety critical infrastructure. But is it possible to have like a one-size-fits-all approach as like a safety risk, a sort of assessment framework when you're looking at different use cases? So for example, if you're looking at AI safety and testing AVs versus predicting when a wind turbine might need to be replaced or something like that, and how practical would this be for like companies to implement? Because it seems like you almost have to take everything on a case-by-case basis, and is that going to be realistic or feasible?
Yeah, that's a great question, whether or not we could just apply one thing broadly, right? Like, could you just come up with one thing to sort of say, everything's safe? I would like that, that'd be the easy answer. I don't think it's ever usually the easy answer, so I think it's going to be kind of hard, and you do have to consider more nuanced things than just, oh, we've come up with one thing for all. I think the recent work in generalizability and like, let's say ChatGPT, which everyone says can do almost anything, it can help you with this, help you with that, help you with another thing. Maybe there's a way people start developing more generalizable safety measures. So you could sort of say, okay, well, this can help apply to an autonomous vehicle or something else, but I'm not sure. It's going to take a lot of work to get there.
Because sort of my way of thinking about it, right, is again being a lawyer, is developing ethical case law companies where you want to have clear examples of this is what a good safety assessment looks like. We're doing A/B testing on this refinery or whatever. But if you go to refinery 2, which is slightly different because of the environment, here's how like, the case law has to build and you build precedents over time, right? But it's just the difficulty, I think, is just that if it becomes too nuanced in all these different environments, it's like almost like you feel like you can just keep doing this forever until everyone throws their hands up and says, no, it feels like we're impossible to meet the burden of food safety,
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And, perfection's kind of the enemy sometimes too. So.
I do have a thought on that, and this just comes from some of the preliminary work we've done talking to, say, automotive engineers and the way that they conceptualize safety. So the systems that we've got today, like the advanced driver assist systems, lane keeping, things like that, they're not even categorized as safety systems. The regulators talk about them as potentially making things safer, but auto manufacturers don't talk about them that way. When we asked, again, this is studies that need to be done. When we talked to the engineers who sort of have been involved in designing these systems over decades, and asked them like, why don't you consider these safety systems? They said, well, we can't test to the extent that we would be able to claim that they're safety improvements that we're making, so we just call them convenience features. So and this is why we felt it was important to talk about something like safety critical systems, because you have to shift the language then to capture these technologies that are currently just almost by fiat being left out of the conversation of safety. So it's not even clear how regulations aimed at safety would map onto systems that in an auto industry are just not considered safety systems for reasons that are unclear. Right? This is the most amazing thing. Why would a system that steers the car and accelerates and brakes not be considered somehow a safety system? It's not. This is why we're trying to do this safety critical definition. Like, we need some category. It's a little bit like what we're hearing in the paper, in Ryan and Danielle's paper. It's like these systems create vulnerability. Let's just call it what it is. It's vulnerability. Like we need to expand the bucket that holds those things that are potentially harmed, like namely people, right?
Nicholson Rice from Michigan Law. I've got 3 points about informed consent, one of which is practical, one of which is more theoretical, one of which is about implications. On the practical side, man, informed consent is so bad. It's like maybe not as bad as doulas in terms of use, but just practically, it's so bad. It's never informed, it's rarely consent, it's not tracked, like it's practically speaking, it's an awful model. I get the desire for it, but oh man, is it hard to implement in any way that's not terrible. On a theoretical basis, I think one of the things that's quite interesting is informed consent arises from, there are these basic values of bioethics from the Helsinki Declaration, the Belmont Report, and informed consent arises from a deeply different one in the space that you're thinking about using it, which I don't know what to make of that, but there's an ethical principle of beneficence and non-maleficence about not doing harm and about doing well, and there's a principle of autonomy and respect for persons, and informed consent is really distinctly over in this bucket. And it's interesting to think about applying it to this bucket, and I think it's a non-obvious move. And I don't know what comes out of that, but I'd love you to grapple with that a little bit. And the last point is about implications, which is just what struck me as different about informed consent than medical interventions is the idea that it's a question of baselines. And I wonder how much of this proposal is really prioritizing the status quo. And it brings Michelle Meyer's work about A/B testing to mind, about the fact that we have an inherent dislike, apparently, of things that smack of experimentation, where we don't question what the existing status quo is. So if you randomly assign a policy, people don't seem to think that you need to worry about just assigning a policy. If you randomly assign a policy to see if it works, people are like, whoa, that's crazy, you're experimenting, I might stop it. And no one asks for informed consent about the fact that there are thousands of really awful drivers right on the street outside. And so I wonder how much this version of the world that says, no, we're going to count this as intervention and the world as not an intervention, is problematizing change in favor of keeping what I think is admittedly a problematic status quo. Super fun paper though, it really got me thinking a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. I take the point on informed consent. It's a mess, right? It's messy. I don't know. I mean, my intuition is that we're better off with it than without it, even if it's messy. And that the problems that we experience in, implementing good systems of informed consent are just they're a reflection of the complexity of the problem we're trying to solve with the underlying, relationships between different people in power and technologies and the public and so on and so forth. So I take your point. Yeah, I think one of the things we definitely need to do is think it through. I think what we need to do is make it clearer what the case is for informed consent. It's certainly not the pedestrian on the sidewalk having to give informed consent, it's some sort of hand gesture to every Tesla that's going by. That's certainly not the proposal that we're making, right? Certainly not. Yeah, I mean, maybe for some people, but certainly the fact that you can't you acknowledge that this testing is happening, that these potential harms, you're exposing thousands, maybe millions of people to potential harms every day, and that would just be simply unacceptable in other technology contexts, right? Completely unacceptable. It would be unacceptable, in the medical. This is why we call them when we're talking about pharmaceuticals, they're just they're like molecular technologies, right? They're just other technologies. They have impacts on people. They act through physical channels that are other than light and sound and cars smashing into you. But it's a weird matter of framing to a certain extent. So that we're trying to play around with the paper. So, but I take your point. Yeah, thank you. Informed consent's it's messy.
Hi, I'm Belén. I'm a PhD candidate in the National Spanish Research Council. I'm now visiting graduate student at UCSD. So I have a lot of points on informed consent, so now I have, I think, a follow-up, because a lot of the things we were discussing were the things I wanted to discuss with you. So I think a lot of my intuition comes from the literature on vulnerability bioethics, which is super related. I think your paper is super related theoretically, somehow, with the paper we were discussing before. So, especially what happens with informed consent when you are talking about parties who are really different in their power and their capacity and their interest, and how informed consent was developed for protecting vulnerable people from abuses, whether that works or not. So my intuition is that the reason you want to include informed consent as a good policy or whatever is because you are concerned about autonomy, and I totally share that, but maybe this point about informed consent would benefit then from including the other literature on autonomy, which is not the liberal informed consent literature, which is relational autonomy, feminist bioethics, even narrative bioethics maybe, and vulnerability literature. I think there's a great book on bioethics and vulnerability by Hundt and Huff, you probably know, by bioethics Hundt and Huff, who engage in this question about autonomy, vulnerability, and whether the individualistic approach to autonomy is really useful for protecting populations and vulnerable people in general. Yeah, I think that was the point, because I was thinking about a lot of things who has already came out. So I really enjoyed the paper. I haven't seen it. So I think if you engage with all these super interesting debates about informed consent, that would be really, really great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm actually having. Did you have something to say about that, or yeah?
I could say something if you want.
Yeah. Okay. Go for it.
Thank you both for those thoughts on informed consent. I think one of my main thinking around that is just, if we are going to be part of a test, I'd like to know that I'm part of the test. And I think that that's where my motivation there is coming from. But I still do have issues with informed consent, and the trouble with autonomy there and the power differentials that come about, I think, with corporations and with physicians and their patients. So I think that would be really worth digging into. And also, I want to talk later about how feminist ethics of care that you work on could be part of that conversation that we could have as well. Thank you.
I just have a suggestion for Caitlin and Jason to take the lessons drawn from the medical profession even further, which I didn't see mentioned anywhere in the paper, which is the M&M conference. As you probably know, morbidity and mortality is the process through which doctors and medical professionals dig into the unpleasantness of cases that went sideways, catastrophic outcomes, patients who died. And its distinguishing characteristic is that it's part of the profession. You can't opt out. You can't be a doctor and say, well, I don't want to do that. It's just, that's part of the deal. Which is the polar opposite of computer science and engineering, where everybody opts out. Nobody really does this. Civil engineers might study bridge collapses and things like that. But sometimes, NASA will be forced by Congress to study the space shuttle crash, or Uber will be forced by the NTSB to get to the bottom of what happened in Arizona. Wouldn't it be great if we had a culture that didn't require government intervention to really confront failure, disaster, in the interest of continuous improvement in public safety? So maybe a paragraph or two on M&M, use that as a jumping off point to say, hey, culturally we could do much better here, look at what's happening.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I hadn't thought about that angle. I'm going to look into that. One of the things we've had conversations with, just in terms of the authorship, is like, well, what do we need to get into a history of anything here? And what's the history there? Because certainly this was not always the case. Right? There's a shift at some point where these principles get internalized. That's something magical. I don't know how that happens. But we need that. A part of the call here is we need that in other places, right? We need that in engineering. We need that in computer science. I don't know how to do that. But this morbidity, the focus on studying morbidity and mortality, sounds like it could be a promising angle.
And to be fair, M&M conferences don't take place without med-mal lawyers in the rooms to kind of monitor the conversation. And that's just the world we live in, but
Sure.
I think it's a good thing to maybe help out.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
But if I can just add to that too, we can't take for granted, I agree with you, there's a lot of medical ethics that is amazing and super interesting that it happens there and it doesn't apply elsewhere, but we also can't take for granted how we arrived where we are today, and 5 years from now what we're going to look back on and be like, oh my god, I can't believe we did that. There are important limits to medical ethics, and there is a really interesting history to the limits of medical ethics up until very recent years. as well that I don't think you can overlook when applying the analogy to robotics.
Yeah, I have a note here. Yeah, it was about, you made a comment about the pulse oximeters, right? So my question is like.
But even Tuskegee went on until 1972, right? And
Oh,
that was
yeah,
under medical ethics.
Well, it was, it's like in this transition phase, right? Where something's happening, and we haven't gotten to the point where, hopefully Tuskegee doesn't happen again. Not to say it couldn't, but you see what I'm saying? It's like, it's not like this is the funny thing about these kind of concepts, right? You come out with the concepts, you propose them, even sometimes they'll get implemented somehow in law or regulation, but it doesn't get propagated through to practice, right? This is like, I think this is what we're talking about. Like, you have the ideas, you've got the concepts, you need those, you need to put them in place, and then like stuff happens, and that's the stuff that I think all of us wonder, like, what happens? Like, is it just like it's like some sort of shift in socialization? It's conferences like We Robot, hopefully, and teaching and things like that. But I don't know. There's like this other element that definitely is worth exploring. I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying it's like it seems separate from the importance of getting the concepts and norms at least identified and put in place, and getting some harmonization, and understanding around privacy or safety.
I think there's a lot
Sure.
of activism that fills
too.
that gap.
Yeah.
But I'll stop taking time. I've already had
No,
my
it's
opportunity.
fantastic. Thank you.
Lauren.
Oh, yeah. So I'm Lauren Scholz. I'm from Florida State. I'm a law professor. So I just wanted to say some small things I liked about each of the papers. So one thing that, so Kegan, I thought it was so interesting and so useful. And what's weird about this is it sounds so minor, it doesn't sound like anything. Like how you made a real clear statement of what the precise upside is from the use of mobile robots. You said you're removing human error from driving and increasing the adoption of fleets of autonomous vehicles could save tens of thousands of lives by optimizing traffic flow. And what I think is so interesting about that, and I'm just coming at this from a lawyer, and you're a computer scientist, I mean, I can tell it's thought. This is when you show you're a hard social scientist by using this sort of setup here. I think that one thing that's often missing in our discussion of newly possible technologies is the benefit side, right? Like, we go into the costs a whole lot, and people are saying like, oh, we're overstating the cost, individuals need to get used to it. But I mean, if we are doing cost-benefit analysis, which, it's an open question about whether or not that's a good idea because of all the known limitations, I think it should be fair to ask those that would put forth AI into nature with all the risks that they carry to have a clear and concise statement of how exactly this AI, with all the attendant risks, is or could, I mean, no guarantees necessary, is or could help humanity. And I think we really see that with autonomous vehicles, and I think this is a really good use case. But I think it's inspiring, and it's interesting to see when you read all the papers about AI and stuff. People are like, well, of course, there are all these potential benefits, but it's not necessary to describe why innovation is good or what potential could be brought to humanity. It doesn't need to be outlaid to justify why this should be done, and I think that that's important. I think it's potentially a path forward. Like, maybe if we're going to limit the use of AI, maybe we might have to have at least some broad-based putative theory of how it actually could be a net benefit to society. So I thought that was an interesting section for that reason. Another thing I wanted to draw attention to is you talked about how there was government guidance. So there's a claim to want government guidance as to how to use ethics, but the original goal was a Bill of Rights, but of course the project ended the white paper in a framework of high-level suggestions, which critics argue is much less ambitious, non-binding, non-enforceable, vague, and flawed. And it had me wondering, especially given how this paper shows we actually can, drill down and measure a little bit the extent to which AI is succeeding at its goals, and it is safe. why time and again, when it comes for public actors to speak, we don't put any guardrails on it. Well, the answer is it's easier and cheaper to have an alibi for any type of practice if there are no clear guidelines. So there's a claim on the one hand that we hate bland, vague guidelines because we need hard and fast rules to comply with, but yet again and again we don't see them. One thing that I think that I'm going to be echoing a lot of people on Jason and Caitlin's paper is I actually think it's really, really interesting and important sort of how it is that increasingly AI is being used in medical practices, but there are all these standards for use of medical tests and medical technologies that suddenly can disappear simply because we're using AI. So I think it would sort of render a type of absurdity that if you can characterize something as technology rather than medicine, which it actually does happen, you can skirt around a lot of requirements. And I do think that that really should be a main focus of your paper, even more so sort of justifying that relationship, because I think it's a really strong characteristic, the sort of the relief. And I actually think the most successful involved in the provision of standard of care, because there's a very simple and concrete action point here. It's like you can't just, you're not allowed to lower the standard of care below what's already available. And again, this is sort of discourses, rhetoric to deregulate or prevent the regulation of the sphere. It's like, oh, it's just too hard. It's hard to have any AI standards. I mean, one thing I really like about this paper is you offer some pretty clear and implementable guidelines. I mean, they're not perfect, and form and consent isn't good, but they're clear enough, especially the provision of standard of care. It's a start, and I think that the more proposals like the ones that you two have, both these two, not you two, I mean both papers, have it, and I think it really is kind of, I would say, what is it, not provocative or challenging in a way, because the more papers like yours it is, the less persuasive the point that we have to throw up our hands and say it's simply too hard to impose any sort of, even the simplest, barest regulatory framework here for managing risk, where you can make it simple, you can even make it quantifiable. Why not? We need a better answer than that. And I think also with the rise of AI, all the things it can do, the idea that it's simply too hard to do, I think becomes less and less persuasive over time. So thanks for your contribution.
Thank you. No, go. I was going to say thank you very much. I want to take you up on one point that you made, which was about feeling like we live in a world where all we're ever doing is kind of dumping on technology, talking about the negative impacts, the risks. I feel like I live in a different world. I live in a world where I'm constantly hearing about how amazing the technologies are going to be, and it takes work to point out the downsides, the potential risks, and to get traction on those things. But I want to take you up on that, because what if, and imagine a world like what if we had strong requirements to clearly articulate the benefits. We have, again, this is a conversation we had in writing the paper. We see this with pharmaceuticals. I mean, there's a clear upside that every pharmaceutical company will claim about every pill that they want to test, right? So if they do that, it doesn't really seem to gain us anything. We still have to do this. We still have to put scrutiny on the technology, especially if we know that they're safety critical. And finally, I just want to say, I think the upshot of what we're trying to say is even in those cases where you've got clearly articulated benefits, if the path to finding out whether those benefits are real or not, because remember, these are potential benefits that haven't been proven out in society yet. So if the path to realizing whether those benefits are real or not requires some sort of testing in public that puts the public at risk, that there are clearly identified risks and potential harms, then we need something more. That's basically the claim of the paper. It's like in those cases where we can identify that, then we need something more. We cannot just take it on faith that it's worth doing the tests because somebody's promised that this technology could do something like reduce the number of crashes on the roads by 30 or 40,000 people a year. we don't accept that in other contexts, and I guess we shouldn't accept it in this. So that's the upshot. But it's an interesting thought, yeah. It's like the requirements to clearly articulate the upside.
Now, Millar, I'm a PhD candidate at the Norwegian Research Center for Computers and Law. So my comment is also to Jason and Kegan. I would really love to see those 3 principles that you propose expanded a little bit more. How do you see them being applied to AI? Because you explain how they work in other fields, but how will they apply? And then yes, I am also going to dig into informed consent. And I think it's really important, as you stated yourself, to make clear in the paper that you are talking about the testing phase and not the deployment phase, because they will look very different when we talk about consent. And maybe you can just say that very shortly and then just drop some of the problems that will arise. But also, as you say, there's a vast body of literature on informed consent, and Hundt also mentions the importance of informed consent not being checking off the boxes, but actually following the procedures and which is the spirit of informed consent. But I think without having to write a paper on informed consent, I've done that, I do not recommend doing that, is to distinguish between informed consent to health treatment and informed consent to health research. They are similar but different. And the requirements are different, and there are exemptions that we can apply to health treatment do not apply for health research. And you mix the two in the text, so that would be nice to separate them and to say whether you talk about one or the other. And also here you could also to update maybe there is discussions on medical AI and informed consent to the use of medical AI. Should it be only informed? Should it be explainable? Or should it also be understood? So there is ongoing lots of research on this now, which would be nice to reflect since you're talking about AI, to have to include this dimension in your paper. And also, you then make a fast jump to informed consent in your case. And I wonder if, are you building from informed consent in health to define a new form of informed consent? Because it's not similar. You say offering them a meaningful opportunity to opt out if they so choose. But informed consent to healthcare and to health research requires opt-in. So voluntariness is extremely important. It's one of the core elements. So without voluntariness, there is no informed consent or no valid consent. So I think, so if you think that should not apply in your case, I think you need to explain why, or say that you are actually proposing a different type of consent. And again, unless you mean withdrawal of consent, but I think you mean, and otherwise you could also have I read a paper as not going into the discussion of the use of personal data for testing, but actually should we test this AI system on you? And yeah, so, but you could also here draw on, as recent case from the European Court of Justice, or the EU Court, are concerning consent when it comes to meta practices, and where they also underline this importance of choice. So you can at least consider if you do want to also elaborate on choice as part of, or voluntariness as part of the consent. Thank you.
These are amazing suggestions. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm hearing to expand much more on the principles. I think talking about this interesting distinction between the opt-in and the opt-out of informed consent and how that aligns with, say, the research versus treatment. This is all amazing. I've taken a lot of notes. Thank you. Very helpful.
Hi, Jesse Wu, Columbia Computer Science, semi-reformed lawyer. I had 2 questions, but I think we're almost out of time there.
Well, we can if they're concise.
I'll ask, the second question was mostly just a show off, so I'll just ask the first real question for Kegan, which was, I had a similar comment to Michael, which was like you go into a lot of like technical detail and specificity in that middle part, and not only do I want to know like why does this matter for regulation, but also it seems like, you know, in 2 to 5 years, a lot of that detail could be obsolete, right? Things change, algorithms change, there's new techniques, and so how can you kind of draw out the broader principles of like, what do these details tell us more about safety regulation or safety filters, and then sort of make that very explicit for some regulators.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and something I'll think about and be working on and working towards. And I think for me, it was starting from a place of I want to start from the technical and move outward. So even if the technical detail, like you don't have to use the exact version of conformal prediction that I'm using in the statistical guarantee, but just starting from that place for the conversation was where I wanted to start, rather than starting from an idea of like, oh, some sort of AI is being used here. And then hopefully, as you continue to sort of work towards the goals that I mentioned in the paper of like, you know, benchmarking against something like a set standard or something like that, that could be maintainable throughout the years as tech progresses and stuff. But it will be a challenge to constantly stay up to date.
Cool. Well, thank you. Sorry, maybe I should grab the mic. I just want to say one more thank you to these authors for such awesome papers and for such a great conversation. Thank you to you all.
We're going to go ahead and get started. So before we begin, you'll notice that we have directions for dinner and drinks here. If you don't see these, I tried to sort of evenly disperse them. But you know, if you see it, take a picture and then like pass it down with your phone if you would like directions on how to get to dinner tonight. It's not robotic engineering or the complexity of a reasonableness test. You look for the big building that looks like Jenga blocks and you walk towards it and it's there. But this is a more specific way of getting to it. The other thing is after this we will have our poster session. We'll have a nice little opportunity. We're going to have the short lightning talks first. Everyone's going to give a 1 minute sort of pitch for their poster. And then we're going to have the ability to go and sort of mingle and interact with poster sessions. We're really excited about the group that we have this year and look forward to you continuing to join us there. And now, with that, I will turn it over to our next panel, Lauren.
Hi, so welcome everyone to our panel. I think it's the last panel of the day, but as I was saying, it's the apex of the day. This is a great paper that Claire has written. I really recommend you guys all take a look at it if you haven't already. But for everyone here to get on the same page, let me kind of summarize the highlights of it. So what Claire's doing in this paper is she proposes that we apply a fiduciary law framework to 2 types of systems that we see frequently deployed throughout society right now. So one, these are AI systems that are deployed to interact with natural persons, like virtual companions, chatbots, and secondly, and this is a separate group, AI systems that influence the environment of natural persons through targeting. These are sort of recommender algorithms that we see a lot. Netflix, you know, when you log on to X, you might see some recommended tweets and the like, and emotion detection systems. This is to contextualize her proposal. Courts are starting to recognize, we've seen some movement on the idea that systems that are used in the place of human fiduciary, so if you're stepping directly into the spot doing what a doctor would do, or doing what a fee-only fiduciary financial advisor would do, if it's an algorithm doing it, rather than a human fiduciary, then we should apply fiduciary law there. There's some case law on this. And this far has been gone because, sort of, as we say so often in the law and technology space, if a human would earn this type of regulation, why not a machine, or vice versa? But she wants to take this a little step further because obviously if you're just interacting with a person, or if you're influencing the environment of a person, you aren't fully acting as if you're their doctor or their lawyer or their priest or what have you. So why is she implying the fiduciary framework? So what is a fiduciary relationship? I'm sure many of you are familiar with this literature, but just sort of a quick summary is a fiduciary tends to offer some type of a service and in order to do this service, they're entrusted with property and or power over the beneficiary, and the entrustment of that power poses risks to the entrustor, the beneficiary person, and monitoring the fiduciaries would be way too costly for any entrustor to do, the entrustor being the user in this case. So hearing those elements, these are out of Tamar Frankel. These are well-known elements of fiduciary, and they seem to apply to these situations that she's described, right? I mean, we can't survey these services. There's a lot of control, and as we had here in the last panel, there are lots of risks, right? So it seems to be a fair fit. So what is the upshot of being a fiduciary? You need a duty of loyalty and a duty of care. In this paper, she primarily focuses on the duty of loyalty. And she argues that having this duty of loyalty, compelling the AI or the company that is deploying the AI to do these set of duties would protect the interest, or necessary to protect the interests of consumers in this area. So one very fascinating thing that this paper does is she takes a framework from a technical paper that came up with measurable goals that can be implemented to test AI loyalty to users. So these are things that, these are operational criteria and ways that they can actually implement it. And these include goal transparency, interest unity, alignment effectiveness, decision transparency, and a couple of other metrics, right? And she maps these onto the elements of fiduciary duties, duty of loyalty, duty of care. And she finds that if you look at these quantifiable, measurable metrics that you can actually test algorithms against, well, maybe not all in every algorithm, but it's possible to do, you actually can test for these goals, right? And it's a theme that has come up a lot in the context of algorithmic accountability. It's all well and good for social scientists to say we have these goals, but how can they be implemented? And she makes the point that there is an overlap between AI loyalty by design and fiduciary duty. So if we come up with the right, so AI loyalty principles that are implementable can be said to be, in some cases, perhaps have the potential to show that fiduciary duties can be met. So this is something that she's advocating for here and sees real potential there. So what are the contributions that I see? That was just a broad overview of her argument, what she's doing here. So what do I see as the main contributions of this paper? So I think that she interrogates the limitations of the information fiduciary concept as constructed by Jack Bolton and expanded by many others. And she doesn't say it's a bad concept or one that shouldn't be put into place, but she notes that it's under-inclusive when it comes to AI, because the nature of the control and influence and vulnerability, to use the phrase of other writers today, isn't necessarily created by or limited to situations when an entity just has a certain amount of information over an individual. With these complex relationships, and this is something I'm adding that she hasn't actually said in the paper, with the nature of AI deployment and the nature of complex interrelations of cloud computing and the like, one can easily imagine a company that is using AI in either of the situations that Claire discusses, who doesn't actually have the data in their possession at all, and might not even be able to directly access the individual user data, but they are customizing this algorithm to reach their goals, and perhaps the other company that they're purchasing the AI from, they're the ones that have the information. So the concept of information fiduciary is under-inclusive when it comes to AI, and thus we kind of need to go back to the full fiduciary relationship to find the necessary protections for users in a world where AI could be everywhere. So a couple other points that she makes. I'm a bit more skeptical at this point, but she makes the contention that with the rate of technology and complexity of this technology, that agencies would be better capable of administrating this sort of regulation than courts. And she makes actually very smart arguments about why exactly she has concerns about the court system. The bar of loyalty and care might be so low that they won't provide any incentive to make AI systems safe, right? Courts might just state the general rules for duty of care and duty of loyalty, find them to be met in most any and all cases, and move on. We've seen so many instances of courts doing just this with so much potentially individual protective doctrine. I suppose my concern with that is a regulatory agency could do the same in the absence of specific legislation. And we see there is a hesitance, say with a court, as much as with an administrative agency, to test the boundaries of the authority that Congress has granted to them. So we see how the FTC, for example, has very broad authority if you look at the statute, but they don't use all of it because they're worried. So I think that there's no substitute for specific, relatively specific guidelines for duty of care and duty of loyalty, because that worry that it will amount to nothing exists just as much in agencies of the courts. But that's my construction, or sort of a light critique, because I actually do think her critique of courts is fair. I just wonder if it doesn't apply to agencies also. I actually thought another really strong aspect of her paper was, and again, I'm pointing to Table 4, where she compares AI loyalty by design and fiduciary duties. It very concisely and clearly shows the limitations of transparency, right? Because when we talk about algorithmic accountability, frequently the discussions center around notions of explanation. But we all sort of know that explanations don't go far enough. And fiduciary duties, the duty of loyalty in particular, very clearly illustrates that what we're looking for isn't just a statement of why we did something, right? In particular, this idea of alignment effectiveness and interest unity doesn't have anything to do with the transparency goals. And the transparency goals are there, but you can see how different metrics are going to have to be brought into play outside of transparency. And I think that's really important to be brought into, to be reminded of in conversations about algorithmic accountability. And one last thing, well, two last things. So she emphasizes the role of feedback in updating the regulatory approach, right? So one of the advantages of one of the things she points out here is that a feedback mechanism needs to be established to allow users and stakeholders to voice concerns on AI fiduciaries. To me, again, this is my little hobby horse, but well, a great feedback mechanism that allow users and stakeholders to voice concerns is the adversarial litigation process, right? So without the consent or cooperation of, let's say, the companies affected, when in the past used to be able to go into court and allege that there's been wrongs. And the back and forth of the adversarial process, I mean, this is a typically American thing, right? I mean, people from other countries, civil law jurisdictions are horrified about the way that we use litigation. But in the past, as we know from so many cases, even opinions that are incorrect, we establish our societal norms through the public response to court cases that the public or legislators find unacceptable. Without the translation of events and fact patterns into legal principles and sort of evaluated in that way, we end up in the situation that we have now where there is just mushy standards indefinitely. So I guess sort of to go into sort of the questions that I have is sort of what sort of feedback mechanism can we have that allows users and stakeholders to meaningfully engage and actually, you know, make some type of difference, because there are always like public hearings and guidelines, but they aren't really meaningful feedback in a lot of ways. So how do we make that stick? So I guess my one big question, and this is really the only one that you really need to think about, I think, is in the two situations that you're saying that we should have fiduciary relationships, when and how is that fiduciary relationship triggered, right? So how do you know that you're in a fiduciary relation? How does a company know that they have a fiduciary relationship with a particular individual? So I have a paper, boilerplate, where I make an argument that much like with a doctor or a lawyer, you know you're in a fiduciary relationship with an entity when you sign a contract with them under certain circumstances, right? So that's where the relationship comes from. Jack would say, well, if you have a certain amount or type of information about a certain person that allows you to do certain things, that's when you know there's some type of fiduciary obligation. So I guess my question to you would be, what triggers the fiduciary relationship in your framework? Because that's a question you'll need to answer, because people have to know when, companies and people need to know when they're bound. So.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great feedback and comments. I am not by any mean an AI or a fiduciary law expert, so any comments, feedback that you have is welcome. I think you made a really good point about the limitations of the regulatory framework, and I think I was already optimistic probably. I mean, for sure there could be regulatory capture and all sorts of issues with that. So I think I will add a section on this. I liked what you said about the fact that it shows that transparency is not enough, and I think I should have made this point clear actually. I think for me, I realized after writing this that for me the way it makes sense is because of trust, basically. So the real basis of any fiduciary relationship is the fact that there is trust, and there has to be trust for it to work. And I realized that in most cases where I think these systems are harmful, they're harmful because there is that level of trust. So if you take the example of manipulation using any sort of algorithm, the reason it's different from watching an advertisement is because you don't know that you're in a context where you can be influenced. I mean, this is an oversimplification. I think there are also other characteristics, but one of them I think is that you don't always know the boundary between the moment you could be influenced and you couldn't, and you trust, for instance, that you're at home just, looking for information online, for instance, or just, you're at home browsing social media and getting information on your friends, etc. So in this case, there's this element of trust, and I think we also see it with AI systems that interact with natural persons, even more so when there's also an element of anthropomorphization, that people tend to trust that technology. And even though there's always a disclaimer with ChatGPT, this could make up fact and this and that, and people keep falling to the same trap and using those information. And then, they say, oh, but it told me this and it told me that. So for me, I think the basis and the reason why I'm conceptualizing this in terms of fiduciary is because of that trust element. And I think something else is that I view fiduciary law as a preventive mechanism, not just something that is meant to repair afterward. So, not just, for instance, a breach of fiduciary duty of care, and then maybe the company will have to pay some damage, etc. But I'm thinking more of the duty of loyalty as something that companies will have to incorporate into the systems that they release, and that could actually prevent harms. Now the question of the feedback loop is a really great question and it's a complex one, because I don't think people could necessarily know that there was a breach of loyalty. So to a certain extent, you may only know there's been a harm. And that is a question, that's an open question. If anybody has ideas on this.
Well, by the way, just to jump in there, to try to begin to give answers, that's a really good argument as to why we need to use administrative state, right? Because the affected people, if this mechanism is working as it should, they probably aren't even going to understand that something's going wrong, that they've been harmed, right? Perhaps a regulator, third-party regulator, is actually much better positioned to go in there. So I think that's a unique benefit from the administrative approach.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Yeah.
And it's not either or. You can actually have a combination regulatory approach, which you see in most things in the United States.
Yeah. So if I were a policymaker and I could make up a bill or something, the way I would think about this is having a bill promoting AI loyalty and empowering some, say, AI agency to enforce it, and to come up with the specifics of how to operationalize AI loyalty inside of AI systems that are deployed, having also feedback mechanisms, because of course these systems are meant to evolve. And there's my co-author for the other paper that we're presenting tomorrow in this room. He was telling me the other day that as soon as you deploy an AI system, like the testing you've done the day before is outdated, basically. I mean, based on not just it being updated, but also the different contexts, etc. So, of course, it should be still very flexible, which is also why I was in favor of an agency, so that the framework can be adapted regularly. And also, I was thinking that would allow for some regular third-party audits that would see, because I don't think the court would be enough, specifically because of that, harm question. Mm-hmm. And also, you mentioned the feedback mechanism. So what I was envisioning would also be for people to be able to lodge complaint with that agency, basically, if they think there's been a breach. So that was the idea. Yeah.
Thanks, Lionel, from the University of Michigan. Good paper. I really like the idea that you get to the heart of what I think is the problem or the issue or concern people have.
Well, one of the things a question I had, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't really understand the full concept of this relationship, but I would imagine it would be different depending on who you are, right? So if McDonald's deployed an AI to sell hamburgers, it would do what's best for McDonald's, right? And it might try to sell me a hamburger, and then I'm very bad to me, for a number of reasons, right? But that wouldn't constitute, could not be a legal problem, right? And so, I mean, so that's one thing. I would think it depends on who it's called to. The second thing is, because I'm not a lawyer and I have no experience with law other than here, it seems like the whole gist of the conversation is almost an assumption that humans are like potential victims waiting to get victimized and we got to protect them, right? But isn't there something in the law that says there's some type of responsibility the individual has? So if you, if this AI says, go buy a Big Mac, and I shouldn't buy a Big Mac, and I go buy it, we don't go so, McDonald's did something wrong, right? Isn't there, like, where is the responsibility? We talk about autonomy, but isn't there some autonomy on the part of the actual individual?
Yeah.
We assume they don't know. But like ignorance is, for every TV show I ever heard, I ever saw about law, they always say ignorance is not, ignorance of the law isn't defense, right? So that may not be true, but I've heard it on a lot of TV shows. But is the same case for the user? I mean, what degree can we keep pretending that the human is completely helpless and we have to jump in with some law to fix it?
So yeah, I love these two questions, thank you. The first one, thank you for pointing that out with the hamburger situation. I think it was a generalization to say systems that interact with natural persons. I need to better define this. For instance, I had in my head, I was thinking of, for instance, AI assistants. And if you think of LLMs today, they're actually in their prompt, it usually says, I am a helpful assistant and I'm here to assist you or something like this. So to me, that kind of goes into this relationship of trust that should trigger some fiduciary relationship. And I mean, obviously, if you interact with someone meant to sell you hamburgers, whether it's an AI system or human, you know that they're going to try to sell you hamburgers. So it's one of those situations where you can't expect that person to be loyal to you and think about your health and your diet. And for question number 2, the question of free will, that's a question I'm very interested in. I am European, so on the question of free will, we're a bit different than here, I guess, in the legal tradition, because we have a stronger body of consumer protection law. And consumer protection law in the EU is based on the idea that there is a differential of power between an individual and a company, even though this person has free will or autonomy. And I think oftentimes I come to these questions with that assumption. To me, it's not that a person is helpless in the face of a robot. It's that this person needs to constantly be reminded that it's not a robot that they're interacting with. It's a huge company that has some goals and incentives and a whole legal department and this and that. And it's difficult to remember that. Wait, there was something else I thought about as you were asking your questions and now I'm forgetting. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
I kind of have a follow-up just about the European versus American mindset. I've never read this case. I just heard about it. I read it, I think, in the privacy casebook I used. It might have been mentioned. But maybe you'll be able to verify it. So apparently at one point in France, there was a little person, someone who was a dwarf, a little person, who was to make money. He was like, all right, you can use me and toss me up and down. So a little person tossing, and he made his business, made money that way. And he understood it. He understood it might have been a little bit degrading, but he chose it. And he was told he had to stop doing it because they were like, even if you don't respect your own humanity and want to give it up for a buck, we're not going to let you do that because we don't want to live in a society where people are like that. It's a reasoning of something along that line. So it's kind of like, it's interesting. It's a completely different mindset. I think there's something to that. I think there's something to respecting people's humanity with meaning something more than having the right to make any dumb decision they won. I don't know why Americans think that's so amazing.
Yeah, so this case, it's interesting. It was considered a violation of the human rights to dignity. And there were a few cases like this. There was this one. There were some around BDSM practices where people got severely injured. And yeah, so it goes to the same debate. But that just reminded me of the other thing I wanted to tell you. Basically, my own opinion is that, I mean, I agree people have an element of free will, but I think also depending on the context and depending on the choice architecture, etc., it's not necessarily easy to exercise it. And so for me, I think that oftentimes in nudging, for instance, people should have the possibility of choosing high-level principles. So for instance, before engaging on a platform that's going to nudge you toward a certain direction, you could, for instance, choose, okay, here is my broad goal. I'm going to give you an example from my personal life, actually. A few years ago, I was working at Boston University. I worked here for 4 years. And I had no idea what the US system was like in terms of anything. I was on a visa. And it turns out I was putting money away for retirement, which I didn't know I was doing. And that was all thanks to nudging, because the default choice was to have this service. And I found out when I left, and I thought about it, and I thought, okay, in my case it works well because I am actually risk averse. I like to promote the long run over short-term decisions. But maybe if I had been in other circumstances, if I had needed more money right now, it wouldn't have been a good decision for me. And I was thinking, when I got hired, it would have been nice if they had asked me a broad question, which was like, do you prefer to put the long term versus the short term? I mean, do you know what I mean? And not phrase like this, obviously, but kind of have high level principles that you can opt into, and then for the next few months, each time you're nudged, it goes toward the direction of your own interest.
Yeah, Peter Sarah, New School. Thank you for the paper and the discussion. It's been great. It was very provocative for me to look at your approach to this, because I've been thinking, how do you get beyond just kind of liability or very sort of highly specified regulations to something like fiduciary duty, which is kind of a high-level principle, but then you can actually cash it out with these examples from law and this loyalty and care as duties, right? And I think for the loyalty thing, I get it, right? Okay, you have these different metrics of loyalty, and you can look at particularly for AI alignment problem, is this aligned or unaligned? And you can use this legal apparatus. So then I was like, okay, care. What are we gonna do for care? And it's just
my gosh, I apologize. Did you reintroduce yourself?
Peter from the New School.
If you want me to talk about care.
What?
We forgot.
Yes. I've been thinking a lot about the ethics of care, particularly in the context of applying it to AI ethics. And it's been done in robot ethics by Andy Van Linsberg, particularly thinking about care robotics and then kind of extrapolating from that. And I like that approach a lot because it starts to flesh out something more about what that is, right? In terms of it's not simply outcomes, it's not simply there's a harm and that's bad, or if we're doing AI ethics, we need to think about all the harms in advance, plan for them, mitigate them, or whatever. But that, in fact, what we have is a relationship, a care relationship, where we have ongoing duties, and we have to respect the individual as the individual. There isn't just some preset thing. So I'm wondering, one, whether that it all works out in any shape or form in standards of care. Are there these sort of relational notions of care? Are there ways we might expand that? Or does it make some sense to actually start importing more of the ethics of care into thinking about fiduciary duties when we implement systems that are meant to care for society, that we actually have these additional obligations? And they're not these simple one-shot things you have to do like a regulation. It's ongoing and it can evolve.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are many people in the room who are better suited than me to answer this question. But in general, in my paper, I adopted an approach, and I don't know if everybody here would agree with this. I kind of worked under the assumption that care is more controversial than loyalty in fiduciary law, and that too, it kind of implies a lower standard of not harming others, which to me is not enough to make AI systems safe. And so I kind of worked with the assumption that loyalty would actually be more inclusive, have better outcomes, but that a duty of care could, for instance, be applied to, say, society at large to address societal level harms, which is probably very controversial and would not would not happen. I don't know if any court would accept that idea that like society can be the beneficiary of a duty of care, but that was kind of my approach. I see. Neil.
Yes, I like the approach. Do more of that.
Thank you for your insight, interesting paper and discussion.
What's your name and where are you coming from?
I'm Satoshi Narihara, Associate Professor at Kyushu University in Japan. Your idea is really insightful. I'd like to ask some questions. Firstly, do you think you need to impose fiduciary duty not only on AI developers and AI providers, but also on AI systems themselves? I think if you impose fiduciary duty on AI developers and the AI providers, they are obligated to design and deploy AI systems in a way of serving best interest of users. As a result, AI systems designed and deployed by them are expected to act in best interest of users. If so, do you need to impose a fiduciary duty on AI systems themselves? My second question, if AI system itself is a fiduciary, do you think AI systems can comply fiduciary duty by themselves? For example, can ChatGPT comply with fiduciary duty by itself? My final question is, if AI system don't comply with fiduciary duty, how can the authority enforce the regulation to AI system? I wonder if the authority needs to enforce the regulations through AI developer or AI provider instead of direct enforcement to AI system. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so actually, a few things on this. One, I should have addressed this in the paper because most of the times when I've encountered this idea of fiduciary AI, it was actually applied to AI systems and not the companies, which is not something I agree with. And I think I should have actually developed that in the paper. The reason why I don't agree with this is that I don't think we should forget that it's the companies that are behind the systems. And I'm afraid that, well, first of all, I don't want us to give a free pass to companies, you know, because, oh, it's the system that's responsible, not the companies. The companies should have incentives to not deploy systems irresponsibly. So that's really where I'm coming from about this. Now, I do agree that in order for companies to comply with fiduciary duties, they would need to embed a lot of those principles into the systems themselves. And actually, when I started working on this 2 years ago, I reached out to a few companies that were developing systems. I reached out to OpenAI, and I didn't end up doing it, but they offered to give me access to one of their models to test how much of fiduciary law it knew. And that was their idea. They were like, oh, we'd be curious to know like how much of fiduciary like the system understands. I didn't end up doing it because, well, specifically because I think in the end it's not really the point. And also, I'm not a technical person. Like these companies would, I think what should happen is regulators or policymakers decide what is a safe system, and then companies actually have to follow that and modify their systems, or not the other way around. Not people wondering, okay, what can these systems do? And then we have to adapt the law when it comes to safety. Does it make sense?
Thank you for the answer.
Neil Richards, WashU Law School. As you know, I love this project, and as you'd expect, I've got lots of thoughts. I'm going to limit them to 5. Well, for now. The first one is, and you mentioned at one point in the paper there are 3 fiduciary duties: care, loyalty, and confidentiality. And I wondered what happened to confidentiality, because I can imagine in an AI context with a chatbot or a therapy bot that actually one of the best protections you might want to have would be don't tell advertiser clients about your vulnerabilities or your medical secrets. So I would encourage you to expand if you're talking about fiduciary duties in their entirety, to expand to the full suite of the 3 related and overlapping duties. Second, there's an implicit division and disagreement in the literature. He's not here, but along with Nicholson's point about not picking fights you don't want to have, between people like Jack who use the F word, fiduciaries, and people like Woody and I who don't. And because we believe that sort of the imposition of full-blooded fiduciary duties might be inappropriate, but that we can learn from fiduciary principles to adapt. So we don't use the F word when we do talk about the traditional duties of care, confidentiality, and particularly loyalty. And that's actually, as a regulatory matter, where US law seems to be going. There's not a meaningful discussion about making companies, even using the term information fiduciaries, but there's a robust and really interesting and promising conversation going on in a number of areas, including AI, health data, and general data regulation of a duty of loyalty. Third, Woody and I, along with our colleague Brian Yuri, who's in the back, and Jordan Francis at FDF, have argued that loyalty, there's a problem with AI half measures, like not all problems are going to solve, not all solutions are going to solve AI. Loyalty is a privacy full measure, but it could be an AI half measure if my loyal text generator is used to create political misinformation. Right? It's being super loyal to me, but it's causing all sorts of problems. Now, your solution, which I thought was really interesting, is the one you just alluded to, of a second subsidiary duty to the public at large. I don't think that works as a concept. I love it. But first, I don't think there's precedent for it. Second, I don't think it works as a conceptual matter because it's no longer a relational protection. But I do think there's a way to use loyalty theory to get there, which is through what we call the loyalty two-step, where there's a general duty of loyalty, and then there's specific protections in particular circumstances. So you can have exceptions to the duty of loyalty where there are adverse consequences to society. Well, it gets you to the same place. HIPAA does this. HIPAA has an implicit duty of loyalty with the treatment, payment, and operations rule. But then there's an exception to that for public health research, or public benefiting health research. All right, moving more quickly. Two final quick points. 4, Kahn and Posen are just flatly wrong on the conflict of interest point. They're not even debatably wrong, they're just wrong. Their paper is good on the other critiques, but my colleague at WashU, Andrew Tuck, has written a paper in the WashU Law Review called A Modest Defense of Fiduciary. Is that what it's called? We cite it in our papers, we get you to cite. But the short answer is Delaware corporate law does not produce conflicted duties, because if you owe a legal duty to someone to do something, that takes precedence over the general duty to advance the interests of the corporation. Just like the minimum wage is not a violation of the corporate, paying people the minimum wage is not a violation of the corporate duty of loyalty, because the more specific law takes precedence over the general residual shareholder loyalty duty. And finally, you had said in your comments that trust is the essence of loyalty, and I agree with that. But I think it's incomplete, and I actually think the completeness is in your paper. Trust in the face of vulnerability or a power imbalance is the essence of loyalty. And I think that's also conveniently the answer to the first question, which is people cannot take responsibility for their errors when they are vulnerable, when they are facing the power imbalance of a large complex entity. Sorry, that's so long.
No, it's very useful, thank you.
Is this working?
I hope so.
I'm Andrew Hundt. I'm a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon. And I think one thing that popped into my head during this discussion actually relates to We Robot paper that I think happened last year. It might have been published somewhere by now. But I think a lot of this was built in the assumption that it's like a company that is running whatever model that's, and so there's a corporation behind everything. But a lot of software doesn't work that way. People might release their model or their weights publicly, and then any individual might be running it. So they might not have the organization or capability of like addressing a problem or knowing that there's a potential problem. Yeah, so like with ChatGPT, you know, OpenAI is behind that, but with like Stable Diffusion, they trained it and then released their weights. And so they provide a service where you can generate images, but other people just do it on their computer themselves. And so, yeah, that might impact some of the arguments that you make. And so I just want to mention that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I agree open source models breaks the relation that would give rise to fiduciary duties, and this reminded me that there was a great article recently on the fact that those companies releasing open source models are then kind of using free labor as people are developing software and things around them and improving the models. And yeah, I don't have a solution for this, and this is a great point.
I think there might also be an additional mechanism where some of these companies are trying to evade responsibility by granting to like a nonprofit, like a university or something, money to build a model. The nonprofit builds the model, releases it publicly, and then they just like use it. And they're like, oh, well, we just got this from this nonprofit. So, and that might also like, strategies people are using to evade responsibility might also be, you know, relevant.
Yeah, so actually embedding fiduciary duties inside the AI systems, like was suggested earlier, would be a better solution for open source models.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe not a similar point is, so there's a paper to be written about the opportunistic use of sort of nonprofit structures by large corporate entities in the information age. Like, for example, schema.org is something that's very, very influential in all types of search, but it's technically not part of Google, except for Google sort of put a lot of their money into it, and really that, along with wiki data and a few other semantic type websites, are sort of they're designed for machines to read, to use, to understand concepts on the internet. And that's something very much built, put together, and designed, and the algorithms operate on them. But the extent to which they're operating based on structures built sort of publicly, but also semi-privately, I think is interesting. And then the question of who's responsible, like if there's a bias in, let's say, schema.org, then it's not Google's fault, it's just a public research, for example.
It's their fault for using it.
What?
It's their fault for using it.
Maybe.
Paul Calhoun, representing myself, knowing only enough about all of these things to be dangerous. So I like the example of the AI assistant. I think that, because if an AI is advising someone, that's sort of analogous to, so we've got a scale of not different, but much larger, because now we have an assistant for everybody, an advisor for everyone, where people didn't previously have access. But I guess raises the question in my mind, I'm interested to hear about enforcement, because these AIs sort of get spun off of a template, but they're effectively quasi-independent. So that means that there needs to be a quasi-independent vigilance capable of maintaining a watch on all of them, or at least enforcing on all of them. And now with the scale, you have the scale of enforcement of how you keep an eye on everything, or if there is a massive problem, how do you organize to deal with it? And I'm just going to bring up a possible blind spot in all of this, which I have a feeling will eventually get involved. When you have a spiritual advisor, you usually know that they have a higher duty to their deity or to their temple of faith because they are sitting in the temple when they tell you something. But now you may have an AI which is trained by some clerical organization that is sitting out there on the internet with a higher duty to the deity or to the faith or whatever. And how does there have to be a disclosure requirement, and how does that really conflict with freedom of religion situations?
Yeah, so, sorry, can you just say one keyword to remind me of the first point? Because I was thinking of the second one.
The idea that you've got lots of advisors, how do you administer all?
Yeah, so I was thinking of something like random third-party audits or something like this, because not only is it impossible to monitor every conversations, but for data privacy reason, you also wouldn't want to do that. Get inside of people's private conversations with their AI and figure out if there's some influence, etc. So, yeah, but of course it's not perfect because things can fall through the crack, and I don't have a good solution for this. And for the second one, I think you emphasized something important, which is I like the point you made about being in a church versus in someone's home, because I think part of the reasons those systems are so influential is also the fact that they're inside of people's private spaces. I think this is a point that Ian Kerr and others have made before. And I don't think, I think the disclosure is important, but I don't think it's going to be enough. I mean, we've seen over and over again how those disclosures are not effective in data privacy. And I mean, among other things, I'm a big fan of designs. I think, well, Ryan has this, I can't remember the name of the concept, like when something is so obvious, is it?
Visceral notice?
Visceral notice, exactly.
I just couldn't hear you.
Visceral notice, yeah. Yeah, so
Woody say it.
yeah, so say you have a chatbot meant to represent some church. Do you want to create an avatar and it looks like a priest? I don't know. I mean, you know, some design mechanism that is meant to really get people to get it is one idea.
So we're at time really quickly. I want to make sure we're going to be able to get everybody in, but what I would like to say is maybe we could just take all the questions and then we can talk afterwards with any responses, just to make sure that.
Great, thank you. I'll be super quick. My name is Beatriz Botero, and I teach law at Science for Law School, and I'm a faculty associate at the department. I really enjoyed your paper. I have two questions for you. One was how you are thinking about this framework and general purpose AI. I felt torn while reading. On the one hand, it seemed like a great way to impose a very general application, not to exploit conflicts of interest. But at the same time, one of the ways in which you define the duty is to achieve the lawful goal they are given in a way that is bounded by values and by the law. And maybe one of the difficult things about these systems is that they have not such predetermined goal the way my financial advisor has the duty to keep my level of risk at a particular level. And actually, because we're short of time, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Sean Garrity. One thing I would love to see you expand on was in page 18, you talked about not selling your own services, but expanding that to a situation where a company is using an AI chatbot, but where is that fiduciary responsibility to either that? Is it to the company or is it to the person using it? It could be as simple as like when I hired a financial advisor, I said fiduciary responsibility to it, and they answered me. I would love to see you expand on that. We did touch on it in page 18, but expanding further, so that's it.
Thank you. I'm Katie Salegi. I'm from the University of Manitoba.
Neil already kind of talked about it because he wrote the paper. But one of the things I think is interesting in Woody and Neil's paper, right, is they're talking about that exploitation and the way in which that arises when a person is vulnerable to exploitation and what we can learn from fiduciary law in that context. And so what I struggled with, like, I love the idea of taking from the concept of fiduciary law to rein in this abuse of power that tends to kind of subvert the balance that we would have an expectation around. The thing that I want to talk about is like a rule of law problem, right, in my work, and some of the stuff that Jason and I have worked on about the design choices that end up sort of encouraging you to behave in a particular way. And so the generative AI space, I think, is an interesting place to explore that because of some of what Ryan and Daniela were talking about this morning in the way that you're being lulled into this false sense of security, and what are going to be the limits that are going to be placed on those design choices in order to encourage the company to accord with that fiduciary duty. I don't know that I got that from the analysis, but I'd love to see it. I wanted to read aloud this virtuous idea here. Our primary fiduciary duty is to humanity. We anticipate needing to marshal substantial resources to fulfill our mission, but will always diligently act to minimize conflicts of interest among our employees and stakeholders that could compromise broad benefit. So that's on OpenAI's website. So they think that they are fiduciaries. So it might be something fun to look at as you continue.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great. So I guess one minute quick response.
Yeah, you can go ahead, please.
Yeah, so the first question about bounding AI systems by law and value, I think this is a really difficult thing to do. I guess that's also why I like that concept of loyalty as kind of someone's best interest. So using, for instance, the question of Meta, when they were optimizing for clicks, they probably didn't realize at first that they were going to optimize for inflammatory language. And then, of course, inflammatory language becomes a proxy for clicks, which is a proxy for profit. And then by the time they realize, they don't really have to do anything about it. And so for me, the way I see it is, of course, you can't, before deployment, you can't be sure that the AI system is actually not going to do anything that is against the user's interest. But I'm hoping that at least when a company is aware of such conflict, they should address it. And I guess that's what I meant by those legal and value boundaries. As for the value, I didn't detail it enough in the paper, and this is something that should be the subject of some democratic agreement. What does it even mean? Different cultures have different values, etc. And it's been a huge issue in generative AI that is imposing colonial values. So that's something I should add. But that was kind of my thinking behind that framework. And okay, I will add more on divided loyalty, page 18, and I will add more on the scholarship you pointed me to, as well as, the statement on OpenAI's website is terrifying. I think in the same way, they've had this kind of double speak where some outline in the blog post in January basically said the reason we've put ChatGPT on the market is for policymakers to realize the potential harms of such systems so that they regulate them. And then they've been lobbying in the EU against the AI Act. I agree. This is ridiculous, and I will definitely look into it.